Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The oil pumping station. It all began with a question that had lingered in the back of my mind for years. Have you ever experienced something so eerie that you doubted your own senses? It was the summer of 2022 when I found myself standing outside the oil pumping station in Oklahoma, a place steeped in local lore and ghostly tales. The air was thick with humidity, and the faint sounds of water flowing, despite the fact that the station had been abandoned for decades, echoed through the dilapidated structure. I felt a chill race down my spine. I was with a group of friends who shared my curiosity about the supernatural. We had heard stories of travelers who ventured into this forsaken place, only to emerge with unsettling tales of hearing water running when no pipes were operational. As we approached, the dilapidated building loomed before us like a specter, its crumbling bricks and shattered windows casting ominous shadows on the ground. The station had once been a lifeline for the nearby town, providing water for homes and farms, but it had fallen into disrepair after a new system was installed. "What do you think we'll find in there?" Jake asked, his voice a mix of excitement and trepidation. "Maybe just some old machinery and a lot of dust," I replied, trying to dismiss the unsettling feeling creeping into my gut. But deep down, I knew we were walking into something more than just a forgotten relic of the past. As we stepped inside, the scent of rust and mildew assaulted our senses. The remnants of a once bustling operation lay scattered across the floor, rusted pipes, broken valves, and faded blueprints. It felt as if time had paused, allowing the past to linger. My heart raced as I began to feel the weight of the stories surrounding this place, stories of the workers who had dedicated their lives to keeping the pumps running, only to vanish into obscurity once the station closed. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. We all paused, straining our ears against the oppressive silence. At first, I heard nothing but the echo of our own breathing. But then it came, a soft, rhythmic sound, like water trickling through the cracks of the foundation. It sent a shiver through my body. I exchanged nervous glances with my friends. "It's probably just the pipes settling," I suggested, trying to sound nonchalant. But even I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. We pressed deeper into the station, our footsteps stirring up dust that danced in the shafts of light breaking through the broken windows. The air grew colder as we approached the heart of the building, where the main pumping mechanism had once stood. I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me, a palpable energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "What if the stories are true?" Jake asked, breaking the silence again. "What if we're not alone here?" My heart raced at the thought. I had always been fascinated by the supernatural, yet the reality of being in a place rumored to be haunted by the spirits of its former workers sent a jolt of fear through me. I had heard about the lingering energy left behind by those who had invested their lives in this place, and now, standing in the shadows of their labor, I felt their presence almost as if they were watching us. "We should probably turn back," Sarah suggested, her voice trembling slightly. But curiosity pushed me forward. "Just a little further," I urged, feeling a strange mix of fear and excitement. What if we found something that proved the stories true? What if we uncovered a piece of history that had been forgotten? As we moved deeper into the building, the trickling sound grew louder, echoing off the walls and wrapping around us like a cold embrace. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn towards something we weren't prepared to confront. In that moment, I felt a rush of adrenaline. What was it that compelled us to seek out the unknown? Why did we feel the need to challenge our own fears? It was then that I realized maybe this was more than just an adventure. Maybe it was a reckoning with our own vulnerabilities. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back of the station, snapping me from my thoughts. My heart raced, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. What was that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. We all turned toward the source of the noise, our hearts pounding in unison. The trickling sound had grown louder, more insistent, as if beckoning us to investigate further. There was no turning back now. We had crossed a threshold, and whatever lay ahead was waiting for us. As I took a step toward the sound, I felt a surge of dread. The air around us thickened, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. What had once seemed like an adventure was quickly morphing into something more sinister. We were not alone. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I took a hesitant step forward. The sound of the water trickling grew louder, almost mocking in its persistence. It felt as if it were coming from the lower level of the station, a place we hadn't yet explored. I glanced back at my friends, their expressions reflecting a mixture of fear and curiosity. Should we check it out? Jake asked, his voice wavering slightly. Yeah, we have to, I replied, though my own voice didn't betray the anxiety rising within me. Something deep inside urged me onward, pulling me toward the source of the sound, while simultaneously warning me of the danger ahead. We descended the narrow staircase that led to the basement, the darkness swallowing us whole as the light from the main area faded. Each step felt heavier, the air becoming cooler and more oppressive. I could almost feel the spirits of the workers pressing on us, their unfulfilled energy swirling around like a storm. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, we were met with a damp, cavernous room. The walls were lined with old, rusty pipes, and the concrete floor was slick with moisture. In the center of the room stood a massive, decaying pump, its once powerful form now an artifact of neglect. The sound of water flowing grew increasingly intense, as if it were alive and aware of our presence. Do you see that? Sarah pointed toward a dark corner of the room. My heart raced as I followed her gaze. There, just out of reach of the flickering flashlight beam, was a faint shimmer, a trickle of water that seemed to be coming from nowhere. It pooled on the floor, creating ripples that danced in the dim light. That's impossible, Jake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The system hasn't worked in years. Maybe it's just a leak, I said, but my words sounded weak even to my own ears. There was something uncanny about the way the water moved, flowing steadily as if guided by an unseen hand. Without thinking, I stepped closer to the source of the sound, compelled by an overwhelming urge to understand what was happening. The moment I crossed into the shadows, the temperature dropped sharply, and I shivered as a wave of unease washed over me. I could feel I was watching, waiting. Wait, don't. Sarah called out, but her voice sounded far away, swallowed by the silence that enveloped me. As I reached the pool of water, the air thickened, and the sound of the trickling water transformed into a cacophony of whispers, soft and urgent, pleading for acknowledgement. My heart raced as I knelt beside the pool, staring into the depths. In the reflection, I saw not just my own face, but images of the workers who once toiled here, their expressions etched with anguish and despair. Do you see them? I gasped, unable to tear my gaze away from the vision. The faces appeared gaunt and hollow, their mouths moving as if trying to communicate, yet no words emerged. It was a moment that felt suspended in time, a glimpse into the past that sent a chill down my spine. Get away from there. Jake shouted, pulling me back to reality. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as I broke the connection. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of my own heavy breathing. What was that? I breathed, shaking with a mix of fear and adrenaline. I don't know, but we need to leave, now. Jake insisted, his voice laced with panic. As we turned to leave, the whispers returned, this time rising in intensity, almost like a chorus of voices urging us to stay. I felt the ground beneath me tremble, a low rumble that vibrated through my bones. The shadows around us seemed to stretch and twist, as if alive and eager to claim us. Run! I yelled, and we bolted back up the stairs, the sound of rushing water drowning out our footsteps. The air grew thick with energy, a palpable force that pushed against us as we raced for the exit. Just as we reached the top of the stairs, the sound of the water crescendoed, and a cold gust of wind swept through the building, slamming the door behind us. We stumbled into the main area, gasping for breath as we turned to face the entrance. What just happened? Sarah panted, her eyes wide with fear. I think we disturbed something, I replied, my heart racing. The weight of what we had experienced began to settle in. The pumping station was more than just a relic, it was a vessel for the memories and energies of those who had once given their lives to it. The spirits were not merely echoes of the past, they were a presence that demanded recognition, that sought to share their stories. We can't just leave, I said, a new resolve igniting within me. We have to understand what happened here. The others exchanged uneasy glances, clearly torn between the fear of the unknown and the magnetic pull of the mystery before us. You want to go back down there? Jake asked, incredulous. After what just happened? I have to, I insisted, my voice steadier than I felt. Whatever that was, those spirits, they need to be heard. If we can understand their story, maybe we can put them to rest. Sarah took a deep breath, her expression shifting from fear to determination. If we're going to do this, we need a plan. We should stick together and bring more light. It's too dark down there. Fine, Jake conceded, running a hand through his hair. But we're going in and out. No getting lost in the dark, okay? I nodded, grateful for their support, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the brink of something beyond our understanding. We gathered our flashlights and made our way back to the staircase. The air felt thick with anticipation, almost electric. I led the way down, my heart pounding in rhythm with the echoing footsteps behind me. With each step, I could hear the water trickling, a siren call luring us deeper into the heart of the station. As we descended, the basement came into view, its shadows growing longer and more menacing. This time, we were armed not just with flashlights, but with resolve. The oppressive chill that had greeted us before now felt more like a challenge, daring us to uncover its secrets. When we reached the bottom, I directed the beam of my flashlight toward the corner where I had seen the shimmering water. It pulled ominously, reflecting the light in distorted patterns. There it is, I whispered, almost reverently. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes wide with both awe and trepidation. It looks alive, she murmured, entranced by the flickering reflections. Jake pointed his flashlight toward the old pump, its metal surface glistening with moisture. What do you think we should do? We should try to communicate, I said, feeling a sense of urgency. Maybe they can hear us. If they're trapped here, perhaps they want to share their story. Sarah nodded, and together, we formed a small circle around the pool of water. What do we say? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I took a deep breath, focusing on the energy around us. We acknowledge you, I began, feeling the weight of the words. We know you're here. We want to hear your story. Please, if you can, show us. For a moment, silence enveloped us, thick and oppressive. The only sound was the trickling water, which seemed to respond to our plea, growing louder as if answering a call. Then, to my astonishment, the surface of the pool began to ripple, forming shapes that danced and swirled in the light. The air grew colder, and I could feel a presence settling around us, an unmistakable weight that pressed against my chest. My breath hitched as I leaned closer, the shapes in the water becoming clearer, faces emerging from the depths, twisted in expressions of anguish and longing. Can you see them? I gasped, my heart racing as I recognized the features of the workers from my earlier vision. Yes, Jake breathed, his voice barely a whisper. They look desperate. Please, I called out, my voice stronger now, bolstered by a rush of adrenaline. We want to help you. What happened here? Suddenly, the water surged violently, sending a wave of chill through the room. The faces twisted in pain, and a cacophony of whispers filled the air, each voice overlapping, merging into a haunting melody of despair. I could make out fragments of words, incoherent yet filled with urgency. They're trying to tell us something, Sarah cried, her eyes wide with fear and realization. Just then, a shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. I turned, the beam of my flashlight illuminating a figure standing in the doorway, a ghostly apparition, draped in tattered work clothes, its face hidden in shadow. The figure pointed a trembling hand toward the pool, then vanished, leaving behind a chill that froze me in place. What was that? Jake shouted, stepping back. Did you see it? I did, I replied, my voice shaking. I think they want us to understand how they died. The whispers intensified, and I felt an overwhelming urge to piece together the fragments of their story. We need to find out what happened here, I said, my voice rising above the chaos. If we can uncover their past, we might be able to free them. But how? Sarah asked, her face pale with fear. I looked around the basement, searching for clues that could lead us to the truth. The old pump loomed above us, its machinery silent yet laden with history. Maybe the pump holds the key. If we can figure out how it worked, we might understand their plight. Let's check it out, Jake said, moving closer to the pump. But we have to be careful. Something feels off. As we approached the ancient machine, I could feel the air shift again, heavy with anticipation. The atmosphere crackled, and a sudden rush of wind blew through the room, extinguishing our flashlights. We were plunged into darkness. Shit. Jake cursed, fumbling for his flashlight. Stay calm, I urged, trying to keep my voice steady. The whispers had risen to a deafening roar, overwhelming my senses. I reached out, feeling for my friends in the darkness. Can you hear me? A moment later, Jake's flashlight flickered back to life, casting eerie shadows against the walls. The sight before us sent chills down my spine. The pump now appeared to pulsate, as if imbued with a life of its own. The shadows flickered and danced around us, reflecting the fear and confusion that swirled within. Then, in that flickering light, I saw them, the faces from the pool, trapped and tormented, rising from the depths of the water. Their mouths moved, forming words that we couldn't hear, and I felt a sharp pang of sorrow ripple through me. They want to be heard, I whispered, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. We have to listen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow across the landscape, we made our way deeper into the remnants of the old pumping station. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of rust and decay, and an unsettling silence enveloped us. With each step, I felt a growing sense of unease settle in the pit of my stomach, as if the very ground we walked on was whispering secrets of its haunted past. "Did you hear that?" Mia's voice broke the silence, her eyes wide with apprehension. I paused, straining my ears against the quiet. At first, there was nothing, just the rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of a night owl. But then, beneath those familiar sounds, I heard it, a faint trickle of water, a sound that felt out of place in this desolate spot. "It's probably just the pipes," I reassured her, though I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. As we approached the entrance, the sound grew clearer, resonating through the crumbling walls. I stepped inside, the threshold marked by a heavy wooden door that creaked ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the darkness enveloped us like a shroud. The dim light from our flashlights illuminated the decaying machinery, shadows dancing along the walls like phantoms in the night. I felt a chill race down my spine as I caught sight of a large, rusted pump at the center of the room, its once gleaming surface now marred by layers of grime and neglect. "Look at this," I called out, pointing to the pump. This must have been the heart of the operation. As I moved closer, the sound of the water intensified, echoing off the walls, yet there was no visible source. It was as if the very air around us was alive with the memories of those who had toiled here. Mia's flashlight flickered, casting an ominous glow. "I don't like this place," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "It feels wrong." I nodded, sharing her unease. The atmosphere was heavy with a strange energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Let's explore a little more," I suggested, trying to sound brave, though doubt gnawed at me. We moved deeper into the station, each step echoing in the silence. The air felt thicker here, almost suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around us. The sound of running water persisted, an unsettling reminder of the life that once thrived here, now replaced by an oppressive stillness. As we entered a large room filled with broken pipes and rusted tools, I noticed something peculiar. There were faint scratches on the concrete floor, as if something had been dragged across it recently. I crouched down to examine the marks, and just then, the sound of water transformed, shifting from a gentle trickle to a rushing torrent, reverberating through the room. "What the hell?" Mia exclaimed, her eyes wide with fear. "It sounds like it's coming from everywhere." The sudden shift in sound made my heart race. "We should go," I said, instinctively taking a step back. But as I turned to leave, I noticed a glimmer of light reflecting off something metallic in the corner. Drawn to it, I hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. "Wait, look at that," I urged, motioning for Mia to follow. We approached the glimmering object, revealing a small, tarnished bell lying among the debris. Its surface was etched with intricate designs that seemed to tell a story of their own. I reached out to pick it up, but as soon as my fingers brushed against it, the sound of water escalated to a deafening roar. "Put it down," Mia shouted, grabbing my arm. The force of the noise overwhelmed me, the echoes bouncing off the walls like a warning. In that moment, it felt as if the station itself was awakening, angry and restless. I dropped the bell, and with it, the noise subsided, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Our breath came out in ragged gasps, and I could feel the fear radiating from Mia as we stood frozen in place, both of us acutely aware of the danger that loomed in the shadows. "Maybe we should get out of here," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. The urge to flee was overwhelming, but my curiosity was equally strong. I knew we had to understand what was happening, what haunted this place. We took one last glance at the bell, its surface glistening ominously in the dim light. I turned to leave, but before I could take another step, a low rumble echoed through the station, reverberating beneath our feet. What was that? Mia's eyes widened in terror as she clutched my arm tighter. I don't know, I admitted, feeling a mixture of fear and adrenaline. We needed to find out what was happening, but at what cost? As we made our way back towards the entrance, the sensation of being watched intensified, and the air grew colder, wrapping around us like a chilling embrace. Just as we reached the door, the water sound surged again, now accompanied by an almost human-like whisper that floated through the air, sending a shiver down my spine. Leave, it seemed to say, echoing from the depths of the station. I hesitated, caught between the urge to flee and the insatiable curiosity that kept pulling me back. Let's go, I urged, pulling Mia with me. We burst through the door and into the open air, gasping as the cool night breeze enveloped us. The sense of relief was immediate, yet the nagging feeling that something was left unresolved lingered in my mind. As we stood outside, trying to collect ourselves, I glanced back at the old pumping station, its dark silhouette looming against the starry sky. The whispers faded into the night, but I knew I would not be able to shake the feeling that something awaited us inside, something that had been waiting for a long time. The chilling night air wrapped around us like a heavy blanket as we stepped away from the station. My heart was still pounding in my chest, a relentless reminder of the terror we had just escaped. But beneath that fear lay an undercurrent of curiosity, a need to understand what we had experienced. What was that? Mia asked, her voice shaking slightly as she glanced back at the old building, its windows dark and foreboding. It sounded like voices. I know, I replied, feeling the weight of her fear echoing my own. It felt like the place was alive, like it was trying to communicate with us. Maybe we should just leave, she suggested, her eyes darting nervously. This place is clearly haunted. There's no reason to go back inside. Part of me wanted to agree. The warnings from the station had been palpable, urging us to turn back. But another part of me, a deeper, more reckless part, craved answers. What had happened here? Who had worked in that place, and why did their energy still linger? Mia, wait, I said, grabbing her arm gently to stop her. We need to know what's going on. What if we're missing something important? What if there's more to the story? Her brow furrowed as she considered my words, a mix of fear and intrigue playing across her face. Fine, she said reluctantly. But if anything feels off, we're out there. With a shared resolve, we took a deep breath and began to approach the station once more. The shadows loomed larger as we crossed the threshold, the once comforting light of our flashlights feeling feeble against the encroaching darkness. The whispers faded to a faint echo as we stepped inside, leaving behind the safety of the outside world. As we moved further into the station, I felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the building itself was watching us, waiting to reveal its secrets. The sound of rushing water returned, louder than before, creating a rhythmic backdrop that played against the walls like a twisted symphony. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I pushed those feelings aside, determined to face whatever lay ahead. This way, I urged, leading Mia towards the large room where we had found the bell. The air grew colder, and with each step, the sensation of being watched intensified, prickling at the back of my neck. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. As we entered the room, the faint glow of our flashlights illuminated the debris scattered across the floor. My eyes were drawn back to the spot where the bell had lain. It was gone. Mia, where's the bell? I asked, my voice low and tense. It was right here. What do you mean? It can't just disappear, she replied, scanning the area with a mixture of confusion and fear. I knelt down, running my fingers across the dusty concrete, searching for any trace of the object. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone else been here? Had the spirits taken it back? Suddenly, a low hum began to resonate from somewhere deep within the station, sending vibrations through the floor and into my bones. I straightened, the hair on my arms standing on end. Did you hear that? Yeah, Mia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. What is that? We exchanged a glance filled with apprehension, but curiosity propelled us forward. The sound grew louder, a strange melody that seemed to dance through the air, almost luring us in. It felt like a call from the past, pulling us deeper into the shadows of the station. Let's follow it, I suggested, my heart racing as I took a step further inside. Mia hesitated but ultimately followed, her flashlight beam flickering nervously across the walls. The path ahead twisted and turned, leading us through narrow hallways lined with rusted pipes and decaying machinery. The hum intensified, becoming almost melodic, weaving its way through the darkness. I couldn't help but feel that we were drawing closer to something significant, something that had been hidden away for far too long. As we rounded a corner, the sound transformed, becoming clearer, a voice, soft and beckoning, echoing from the shadows. Help us, it seemed to plead, resonating deep within the very fabric of the station. Who is that? Mia gasped, her breath quickening. What do they want? I don't know, I replied, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. But we need to find out. The voice led us to a large chamber at the back of the station, where the remnants of old machinery lay scattered like forgotten relics. In the center of the room stood a tall, decaying water tank, its surface covered in a thick layer of grime. The sound of rushing water flowed around it, pulsing like a heartbeat. Do you think the voice is coming from there? Mia asked, her eyes wide with uncertainty. I stepped closer, drawn by the soft, haunting melody that seemed to emanate from the tank. I think so. We have to see what's inside. As I reached out to touch the cold metal surface, a sudden rush of air swept through the chamber, extinguishing our flashlights and plunging us into darkness. Panic surged within me as I fumbled to turn them back on, my heart racing. Mia, are you okay? I called out, my voice echoing in the void. I'm here, she replied, her voice shaky. What just happened? The lights flickered back to life, casting an eerie glow across the room. But as I turned back toward the tank, my breath caught in my throat. There, pressed against the glass, were the faces of those who had worked in the station long ago, ghostly figures with hollow eyes and desperate expressions, their mouths moving silently in a wordless plea. Help us, they echoed, their voices merging with the rushing water, creating a chorus of sorrow that filled the chamber. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. The spirits of the past were trapped here, their energies entwined with the station. They were the ones calling for help, forever bound to the place where they had once toiled. Mia, we have to do something, I exclaimed, the weight of their sorrow pressing down on my chest. They need our help. But as I spoke, the chamber began to tremble, the ground shaking beneath our feet. The ghosts seemed to writhe in agony, their faces twisting in fear. Leave, they echoed again, their voices rising in desperation. What's happening? Mia shouted, her eyes wide with terror. I don't know. We have to get out, I yelled, pulling her toward the exit. But as we turned to run, the water tank erupted with a deafening roar, sending a cascade of water crashing down around us. Run! I screamed, adrenaline fueling my every move as we raced toward the door. The chamber was collapsing, and the spirit's cries filled my ears, echoing with urgency. As we burst through the door and into the open air, the world outside felt surreal, as if we had emerged from a nightmare. I turned to look back at the station, now a dark silhouette against the night sky, the water crashing down like a waterfall. The whispers faded into the wind, leaving behind an unsettling silence. What just happened? Mia panted, her eyes wide with disbelief. What do we do now? I don't know, I replied, my mind racing. But we can't leave it like this. We need to find a way to help them. The weight of what we had just witnessed settled heavily on my shoulders. We had uncovered something far more significant than we had anticipated, and the spirits of the past were depending on us to unlock the truth. The cool night air felt strangely oppressive as we stood outside the station, still reeling from the chaos we had just escaped. My heart raced with a mix of fear and determination. The spectral faces pressed against the tank haunted my thoughts, and I could feel their desperate pleas reverberating in my mind. We can't just leave them, I said, breaking the silence that hung heavily between us. They're trapped here. We have to find a way to help them. Mia looked at me, her expression a mix of fear and uncertainty. But how? What can we possibly do against whatever that was? I took a deep breath, trying to quell the rising tide of anxiety. I don't know yet, but we need to find out more about this place. There has to be something in its history, records, stories, anything that can shed light on why these spirits are trapped. Reluctantly, Mia nodded, and we began to walk back toward the parking lot, each step echoing our unspoken fears. We had come to this old station in search of adventure, but now we found ourselves caught in a web of mystery and sorrow that we hadn't anticipated. As we drove back to town, I felt an overwhelming urge to dig deeper into the history of the pump station. A flicker of hope ignited in my chest. Perhaps the local library could hold the answers we were looking for. It was a small town library, filled with dusty tomes and old newspapers, but if there was anything worth uncovering, it would be there. We should check the library first thing in the morning, I said, breaking the silence in the car. They might have archives or records about the station. Yeah, Mia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll help you research. The rest of the drive was consumed by a heavy silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that the past was beckoning us, urging us to unravel its secrets before it was too late. The sun broke over the horizon the next morning, casting a warm glow that felt like a blessing after the coldness of the night before. With a sense of purpose, we made our way to the library, the familiar scent of old paper and leather welcoming us as we stepped inside. We headed straight for the local history section, the shelves lined with books and dusty archives. My fingers danced across the spines, searching for anything related to the pump station. Finally, I found a thick, leather-bound volume labeled History of the Oklahoma Waterworks. This could be it, I said, pulling the book from the shelf and opening it to the first page. The faded text spoke of the station's construction in the early 1900s, detailing the lives of the workers who had dedicated themselves to its operation. As I flipped through the pages, snippets of information caught my eye, tales of accidents, the hardships faced by the workers, and whispers of a tragedy that had befallen the station during a particularly harsh winter. Mia, come look at this, I called, beckoning her over. There was a huge accident here. Many people died. She leaned over my shoulder, her eyes widening as she read the passages. What does it say? How did they die? Looks like there was a massive flood caused by a broken pipe, I explained, tracing the words with my finger. It says that several workers were trapped inside when it happened. Trapped, Mia echoed, a chill running down her spine. Just like the spirits we saw. Exactly, I replied, my mind racing. They were never given a proper burial or even acknowledged. They might be bound to this place because of the way they died. As we delved deeper into the book, we began to piece together the tragic history of the pump station. The names of the workers who had perished were listed alongside their contributions to the station. A sense of urgency grew within me. We needed to honor their memory somehow. There's a mention of a memorial service held for them decades ago, I noted, flipping to another page. But it was never formalized, and over time, the history faded. No one remembers them anymore. Mia looked thoughtful, her brow furrowing. What if we organized something? A small memorial for them? It might help to release their spirits. It was a noble idea, and as I considered it, I could feel the echoes of the past calling out for recognition. You're right. We can't just leave it like this. They deserve to be remembered. We spent the rest of the day gathering information, searching for any surviving family members or historical records that might help us establish a connection to the past. It was a task that felt daunting but necessary. As we worked, I could feel a shift in the atmosphere around us, as if the spirits were watching, hoping for our success. By the time dusk settled over the town, we had a plan in place. Armed with the stories of those who had suffered, we decided to return to the pump station that evening to honor them. We gathered candles, flowers, and the history we had uncovered, determined to create a small memorial in their memory. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, we drove back to the station with a heavy heart but a resolute spirit. The building loomed in the twilight, its presence both menacing and familiar. We set up our makeshift memorial just outside the entrance, placing candles in a circle and surrounding them with flowers. I recited the names we had found, each one a whisper in the night, a plea for recognition that echoed in the darkness. Mia, do you feel that? I asked suddenly, as a cool breeze swept through the air, rustling the leaves around us. Yeah, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It's like they're here with us. Taking a deep breath, I closed my eyes and focused on the spirits, hoping they could feel our intention. We honor you, and we remember your sacrifices. You are not forgotten. As the last echoes of my voice faded, a calm settled over us. The atmosphere shifted, becoming lighter, as if the weight of the past was slowly lifting. I opened my eyes, a flicker of hope igniting within me. Then, from the depths of the station, a soft melody began to resonate, a hauntingly beautiful tune that floated through the air. The whispers of the spirits surrounded us, echoing gratitude in a symphony of voices. Help us, they sang, but this time, the urgency had transformed into a peaceful plea, a longing for release. Mia and I exchanged a glance, an understanding passing between us. We had taken the first steps to honor them, and perhaps, just perhaps, it was enough to begin the healing process. But as we stood there, the melody grew louder, swirling around us like a vortex of energy. Suddenly, a shadow emerged from the entrance of the pump station, a figure cloaked in darkness, its features obscured, yet its presence palpable. Who are you? I demanded, my heart racing. The figure stepped forward, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes that mirrored the desperation of the spirits trapped within. You have awakened us, it said, its voice a haunting whisper that sent chills down my spine. But the past is not so easily released. The darkness loomed closer, the air growing colder around us. My pulse quickened as I realized that we were not merely observers in this tale, We were now entwined in the very fabric of its conclusion. The figure before us hovered in the doorway, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. A chill crept through the air, and I could feel every hair on my body standing on end. The haunting melody from within the pump station intensified, echoing our fear and uncertainty. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling as I stepped back, pulling Mia with me. "What do you want?" "We are the echoes of those who perished," the figure whispered, its voice resonating with an otherworldly quality. "You have disturbed the balance, and now the threads of fate are intertwined with yours." "What do you mean?" Mia asked, her eyes wide with fear. "We only wanted to help." "Help?" The figure laughed, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "You seek to mend what was broken, but some wounds run deeper than the flesh. You are not prepared for the truth that lies beneath." I felt my heart racing. "What truth? What do you want from us?" The spirit stepped closer, the darkness swirling around it like a tempest. "You will come to understand in time, but know this, the past cannot be undone. It must be faced." Suddenly, the candles flickered violently, casting eerie shadows across the ground. I turned to Mia, who looked equally bewildered and terrified. "We need to leave," I said urgently, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. "Why are you here?" Mia cried, her voice breaking. "What do you want from us?" "Your souls are tied to this place now," the figure replied, its eyes burning with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You have awakened the memories, and they will not let you go so easily." I felt a wave of panic rise within me. "We didn't mean to. We just wanted to honor the dead." The figure's laughter echoed through the night, filled with a dark mirth that sent chills through me. "Honor? You think it is that simple? The boundaries between the living and the dead are fragile. You will face the consequences of your actions." Before I could respond, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the atmosphere around us shifted drastically. The shadows grew darker, creeping closer as if they were alive, and the melody that had once been beautiful turned into a dissonant cacophony. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Mia's hand and pulling her away from the station. We sprinted towards the car, the shadows chasing us, whispering our names in a haunting chorus. As we reached the vehicle, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The sound of footsteps echoed behind us, the darkness swirling with malevolent intent. I finally got the door open, and we jumped inside, slamming it shut as if to block out the encroaching shadows. Breathless, I turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life as I glanced into the rearview mirror. The figure stood at the entrance of the pump station, its form dissolving into the darkness, but its presence lingered like a specter. "What was that?" Mia gasped, her face pale with fear. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "But we need to get out of here." I peeled out of the parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as we sped down the winding road. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees looming like sentinels in the dark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "What if they come after us?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "We'll figure it out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We just need to get somewhere safe." But even as I said the words, a cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The knowledge that we had disturbed something ancient and powerful loomed over us, casting a shadow on our every thought. We drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the rustle of leaves outside. The town came into view, its lights twinkling like stars against the darkness, but I couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that hung in the air. When we finally reached my house, I parked the car and turned to Mia, who was still trembling. "We need to come up with a plan," I said, my mind racing. "We can't just ignore what happened." "Plan for what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That thing, it said we're tied to this place now." "What does that mean?" "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. "But we need to find out. We have to learn more about the spirits and what they want." As we sat in the car, the darkness seemed to close in around us. The shadows danced at the edges of our vision, and I could feel the spirits lingering, watching, waiting. "Let's go back to the library tomorrow," I suggested. "We need to dig deeper into the history. There has to be something there that can help us understand." Mia nodded slowly, still visibly shaken. "Okay, but what if we can't figure it out? What if they come for us?" "We'll face it together," I promised, though a part of me felt a creeping doubt. We can't let fear control us. We have to honor them, find a way to set them free. As we stepped out of the car and made our way inside, I felt a chill race down my spine. The veil of shadows lingered in the corners of my mind, a constant reminder that our journey was just beginning. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in my mind. The figure, the shadows, the haunting melody, they all intertwined, forming a web of fear and desperation that enveloped us. And then, in the quiet of the night, a faint whisper floated through my thoughts, a soft reminder of the spirits trapped within the pump station. "Help us." The following day dawned with an unsettling stillness. I felt the weight of the spirits pressing down on me as I prepared to head to the library with Mia. My mind swirled with questions, each one more pressing than the last. What had we awakened in that pump station? And how could we possibly put it to rest? Mia and I arrived at the local library, a quaint brick building that had stood for generations. The scent of old books greeted us, a comforting aroma that belied the terror we had faced. We knew we needed to find answers, and we began scouring through dusty tomes and local archives, looking for anything related to the pump station. Hours slipped by as we pored over records, newspaper clippings, and old photographs. With each piece of information we uncovered, the reality of the spirit's plight grew clearer. The pump station had a dark history, one riddled with tragedies and untold stories of those who had worked there. "Mia, look at this," I said, pointing to an article dated back 50 years. It detailed the explosion that had claimed the lives of several workers, their names listed at the bottom in a sorrowful tribute. These were the spirits we encountered. Mia leaned closer, her brow furrowing. "They're not at rest because of what happened to them. They're trapped here, bound to this place by their unfinished business." I nodded, feeling a chill race down my spine. We need to find a way to help them move on. But how? Just then, a librarian approached us, an elderly woman with kind eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom. "I couldn't help but overhear," she said gently. "You're looking into the history of the pump station, aren't you?" "Yes," I replied, my heart racing. "Do you know anything about it?" "The station has a reputation for being haunted," she said softly. "Many believe the spirits of those who died there linger, seeking closure for their tragic fates. There's an old ritual. It's said that if you honor their memory and speak their names aloud at the site, it can bring them peace. Do you think that would work?" Mia asked, hope flickering in her eyes. The librarian smiled sadly. "It's worth a try. Just remember, they are not the only ones who are watching." I felt a shiver run down my spine at her words. "What do you mean?" "There are darker forces at play, forces that feed on fear and despair. They may not take kindly to your attempts to help. The weight of her warning hung in the air as we exchanged anxious glances. "We have to try," I said firmly. "If there's any chance we can help them, we must." With newfound determination, Mia and I returned to the pump station later that evening, armed with the knowledge we had gathered. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow on the dilapidated structure. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and the wind whispered secrets through the trees. As we approached the entrance, the haunting melody rose again, a chilling reminder of the spirit's presence. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. "We can do this," I reassured Mia, though doubt lingered in my mind. We entered the pump station, the air thick with tension. The shadows danced around us, and the faint sounds of rushing water echoed through the halls. I could feel the spirits drawing near, their energy palpable. "Let's start by speaking their names," I suggested, recalling the list we had found in the library. We stood in the center of the room, the flickering light casting ghostly shapes around us. "Martha, James, Daniel, and Sarah," I called out, my voice steady. "We honor you in your memories. We recognize the pain you suffered and the lives you lost." The atmosphere shifted, and I felt a rush of energy, a tingling sensation coursing through my veins. The melody intensified, echoing our words as if the spirits were responding. "Please, find peace," Mia added, her voice trembling. "You don't have to suffer anymore." Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the flickering candlelight. Darkness enveloped us, and I felt a sense of dread creeping in. "Stay close," I whispered, gripping Mia's hand tightly. Out of the shadows, the figure appeared once more, its form more defined than before. "You think you can help us?" it taunted, its voice a chilling whisper. "You are merely children playing in a game you do not understand." I felt my heart race, fear clawing at my insides. "We're not playing. We want to honor you." The figure laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "You cannot honor the dead without facing the darkness that binds them. You must confront what lies beneath." As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, I realized the truth behind its words. To truly help the spirits, we had to confront our own fears, the darkness within ourselves. "We accept that challenge," I said, surprising even myself with my courage. "We will face whatever it is you want us to face." The shadows shifted, swirling around us like a tempest. "Very well," the figure hissed, "but know that not all who venture into the darkness return unscathed." In that moment, the ground beneath us trembled, and I felt a surge of energy, a powerful force trying to pull us into the abyss. I closed my eyes, focusing on the spirits, the memories we had honored. "Help us," I cried out, my voice cutting through the chaos. "We are here for you." The shadows recoiled, and the figure faltered, its form flickering as if caught between two worlds. The air grew heavy with emotion, and I could feel the spirits reaching out, their presence growing stronger. Mia squeezed my hand, and I felt her resolve merge with mine. Together, she whispered, and we focused on the warmth of their memories, the love that had once surrounded them. Slowly, the shadows began to dissipate, revealing a flickering light that emanated from the depths of the pump station. The haunting melody transformed into a harmonious chorus, lifting the oppressive weight that had shrouded us. With one final push, I called out, "You are free. You no longer have to suffer." As the darkness receded, the figure let out a haunting wail, a mixture of relief and sorrow. Then, in a blinding flash, the spirits erupted into brilliant light, filling the room with warmth and peace. I felt their energy wrapping around us like a comforting embrace, a final farewell. The figure melted away into the light, and the air became still, the overwhelming presence of fear vanishing. Mia and I stood there, breathless and overwhelmed, as the echoes of the past faded into silence. In the aftermath, a calm settled over the pump station. We had faced the darkness, and in doing so, we had freed the spirits trapped within. As we stepped outside, the moon illuminated the path before us, casting a serene glow over the night. The air felt lighter, and a sense of peace washed over me. We had done it. We had honored the memories and faced our fears. But as we turned to leave, a lingering whisper floated through the air, a reminder that the shadows would always be there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close. In sheep's clothing. Have you ever wondered if the world around you is as peaceful as it seems, or if something dark hides just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike? It was a question I never thought to ask myself, not until that night, the night everything changed. My name is Ivan, an ordinary man with a string of bad luck and a few too many mistakes to my name. Life hadn't exactly been kind, but I'd learned to survive on the streets, invisible to those who pass by. Maybe that's why I was the only one who saw him, the man everyone was searching for. A killer, hiding in plain sight, blending into the city like he belonged. But there was nothing normal about him, and deep down, I knew it. There was something haunting, something unearthly in his eyes. And from the moment I saw him, I knew I was in danger. It started on a cold, silent night in November, the kind where even the streetlights seemed dimmer, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty sidewalks. I was huddled beneath a warm blanket, hidden away in an alley, trying to stay warm. It was an ordinary night for me, lonely, cold, and filled with a dull ache that gnawed at my bones. But then I heard it, a faint shuffling, the kind of sound that raises the hair on the back of your neck. At first, I thought it was just another drifter, someone like me, searching for shelter in the shadows. But when I peeked out from behind the dumpster, my blood ran cold. Standing in the middle of the alley was a man, tall and eerily still, staring down the street as if lost in thought. His posture was too controlled, too stiff, like he was holding something back. I watched him from the shadows, my breath shallow, afraid he'd hear even the smallest sound. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put into words. He wore a plain, dark coat, the kind that looked expensive but subtle, blending him into the background. His face was partially hidden by the collar, but I caught a glimpse of his eyes, sharp, piercing, and filled with a kind of malice I'd only ever seen in nightmares. They weren't the eyes of a man, they were the eyes of a predator. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was projecting my own fears onto a stranger. But the longer I watched him, the more certain I became. This man was dangerous. He had an aura about him, a dark energy that filled the space like a thick, suffocating fog. I wanted to turn away, to retreat back into the darkness and pretend I'd never seen him. But something held me there, rooted to the spot. It was as if I was trapped in his gaze, unable to look away. As I watched, he lifted his hand and checked something in his pocket, a small object that caught the faintest glimmer of light. A flash of metal. A knife? No, something else. I strained my eyes, trying to make it out, but he moved too quickly, slipping the object back into his coat before I could see. My pulse quickened. Whoever this man was, he was hiding something, and my gut told me it was nothing good. Then, without warning, he turned his head, his gaze sweeping the alley, his eyes narrowing as if he could feel my presence. I ducked back behind the dumpster, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I waited, holding my breath, praying he would leave, but instead, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the alley like the toll of a distant bell. Closer and closer, each step dragging out an eternity. I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay hidden, but every instinct in my body screamed for me to run. This was not a man I wanted to encounter. Not here, not anywhere. But as much as I wanted to flee, something kept me there, rooted in place, as if drawn by a morbid curiosity. A part of me needed to know what he was doing, why he was here, and what he was hiding. But deep down, I already knew he was hunting, and I was dangerously close to becoming his prey. When the footsteps stopped, I dared to peek out again, just a quick glance. The man was gone. The alley was empty, silent, as if he had never been there. But the sense of dread lingered, thick and heavy, wrapping around me like a shroud. I knew, in that moment, that I had just come face to face with something evil, something beyond my understanding. And I knew, somehow, that this would not be the last time our paths crossed. I stayed frozen in the shadows long after he disappeared, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get out of that alley, to leave the city if I had to. But I didn't move. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there somehow, watching me from the darkness, his gaze cutting through the cold night air like a blade. Finally, after what felt like hours, I forced myself to leave. I slipped out of the alley, my head down, blending into the faceless crowd of late-night wanderers and city workers. Even in the open streets, I couldn't shake the feeling of his presence. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking behind me, his cold eyes following my every step. The city was different that night. The familiar streets and alleys, the places I knew so well, felt foreign, hostile. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner a trap. I kept to the main streets, avoiding the narrow, dark paths I usually took to stay out of sight. It was like a switch had flipped inside me, an instinct I didn't know I had. I couldn't explain it, but something inside me was screaming that he was near, that I was walking through a web he'd set up, and every step brought me closer to its center. As I turned onto another street, I nearly collided with a police officer. He was young, maybe a few years older than me, with a tired look in his eyes. He gave me a brief glance, barely registering my existence, and walked past without a word. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it. Police don't pay attention to people like me. But tonight, it felt different. An idea struck me, a desperate, reckless idea. I could tell him. I could tell someone about the man I'd seen, the danger I felt in my bones. But as I turned, thinking to call after the officer, I froze. How would I even begin to explain? What would I say? I saw a man in an alley, and I think he's, what? Dangerous? A killer? He hadn't done anything, at least not that I'd seen. And the way he looked at me. No one would believe me. I let the officer disappear down the street, and a cold wave of helplessness washed over me. I was on my own in this. Whatever I'd seen, whatever was lurking in those shadows, it was my problem now. And somehow, I knew that going to the police would only make things worse. I kept walking, each step heavy with dread, but I couldn't go far. The city seemed to be closing in around me, the narrow streets and high buildings pressing down, trapping me. I needed to get off the street, somewhere safe, somewhere I could think. My mind raced, desperate for a plan, an escape, but I kept coming up blank. Finally, I spotted an old, abandoned building down a side street. I'd spent a few nights there before, hidden away in a corner, and I knew it well enough to feel safe, at least as safe as I could be under the circumstances. I slipped inside, the air damp and stale, filled with the smell of decay and neglect. The building was dark, quiet, with only the faintest creaks echoing through the empty hallways. I found my usual spot, tucked behind a broken window where the cold wind seeped in, biting at my skin. But I didn't mind. The cold kept me awake, alert. I wrapped my arms around myself, huddling against the wall, and closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing heart. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those piercing eyes boring into me, and I knew no matter how far I ran, he would find me. And as the night stretched on, with only the distant sounds of the city to keep me company, I started to wonder if I would ever feel safe again. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching longer than the last. I tried to keep my eyes open, to stay alert, but exhaustion crept in like a thief. I hadn't slept properly in days, and the events of that night had drained me. The city sounds outside, the faint hum of distant traffic, the occasional shout or siren blurred into a low, muffled background. It was almost comforting, in a strange way, like a lullaby from a world that had forgotten me. But just as I began to drift off, a sudden noise snapped me back to attention. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but in the dead silence of the abandoned building, it echoed like a gunshot. My heart hammered as I strained to listen, every muscle tense. It came again, a soft, scraping sound, like footsteps on concrete, moving slowly down the hallway outside. I held my breath, pressing myself further into the shadows. It could have been anything, an animal, another homeless person looking for shelter. But deep down, I knew better. That same icy dread washed over me, the same instinct that had gripped me in the alley. It was him. Somehow, he had found me. The footsteps stopped just outside the room. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. I pressed myself back against the cold wall, my mind racing, desperate for a plan. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. I was trapped. The door creaked as it opened, just a crack, letting in a sliver of pale moonlight. In that moment, I saw him, his silhouette framed in the doorway, still and silent, as if he were savoring the moment. I could barely make out his face, but I didn't need to see it to know he was smiling. I could feel it, that cold, twisted satisfaction radiating from him, filling the room like a noxious gas. My body was frozen, every instinct telling me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. All I could do was watch, paralyzed, as he stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. He seemed to glide across the floor, his eyes fixed on me, unblinking. I was prey, caught in his gaze, helpless to escape. "Why are you hiding?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was a razor-sharp edge to it, a barely contained violence. He took another step, and then another, closing the distance between us. "You saw me, didn't you?" I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my mouth unable to form words. I just stared at him, feeling the walls closing in, my mind racing for an escape, but finding none. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his eyes boring into me. "I don't like people who see too much," he murmured, his voice like a blade slipping between ribs. "It makes them dangerous." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and I knew, with a sick certainty, that he wasn't going to let me leave. This man, this monster, had marked me. I was part of his game now, a piece in whatever twisted puzzle he was playing. And as he pulled back, still smiling, a dark thought crept into my mind. This wasn't just a chance encounter. He had found me for a reason. And whatever that reason was, it was only the beginning. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, watching him, feeling his gaze burn into me. My mind was a chaotic mess, filled with fragments of thoughts, plans, desperate ideas. But none of them made sense. There was nowhere to go, no way to escape. The air in the room felt thick and heavy, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Then, as if sensing my terror, he took a step back, his eyes never leaving mine. He tilted his head slightly, studying me, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You know, it's rare to find someone as observant as you," he said, his tone dripping with something I couldn't quite identify. Was it amusement? Curiosity? Whatever it was, it terrified me even more. My voice finally broke free, shaky and barely more than a whisper. What do you want?" He smiled, a slow, sinister curve of his lips that made my blood run cold. "What do I want?" he echoed, almost as if the question amused him. He paused, seeming to savor the moment, letting the silence stretch out between us until I thought I might scream. "I want you to keep your eyes open," he said softly. "To watch. To see things that others don't." I didn't understand what he meant. My mind was spinning, trying to grasp his words, but they slipped through my thoughts like water through my fingers. I don't know what you're talking about," I managed to say, my voice trembling. He chuckled, a low, chilling sound that seemed to reverberate through the empty room. "Oh, you will," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Soon enough." With that, he turned and walked back towards the door, leaving me in a stunned silence. He moved with a strange, unnatural grace, as if he were gliding rather than walking. He reached the doorway and paused, glancing back at me one last time. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, cold and predatory. "Remember," he said, his voice echoing in the silence, "I'll be watching." And then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. I waited, holding my breath, listening to the faint sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway. While I was sure he was gone, my body finally released the tension, and I slumped against the wall, feeling the weight of everything crash down on me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice, that haunting, mocking tone that filled me with a fear I couldn't shake. I was trapped in a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. And as the first light of dawn crept into the room, I knew one thing for certain. My life would never be the same. I left the building as soon as the sun rose, feeling like a ghost drifting through the early morning streets. The city was quiet at this hour, the usual hustle still a few hours away. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with the few people I passed, my mind racing with the memory of the man, his words, his eyes, that chilling smile. All I wanted was to disappear, to vanish into some corner of the world where he'd never find me. But even as I thought it, I knew it was pointless. He had marked me, left his invisible handprint on my life. Running wouldn't make a difference. I wandered aimlessly for hours, the weight of sleeplessness and fear dragging me down. Eventually, I found myself in a quiet park at the edge of the city, a place where people rarely ventured this early in the morning. I sat on a bench, my head in my hands, trying to gather my thoughts. I knew I couldn't stay on the streets, not after last night. I needed somewhere safe, somewhere he couldn't reach me. But where? That's when I remembered her. She was a woman I'd seen a few times on the outskirts of the city, a lonely figure who often wandered the markets, talking to the vendors with a warm smile. I didn't know much about her, only that she seemed kind, generous in a quiet, unassuming way. And, most importantly, she lived alone. It was a long shot, but I didn't have many options. By midday, I made my way to the neighborhood where I'd seen her before. It was a modest part of the city, where the buildings were old but cared for, their walls worn but clean. I felt out of place here, my clothes tattered and stained, but I pushed down that self-consciousness and kept going, my mind focused on my goal. After some searching, I finally spotted her, browsing a small stall at the edge of a quiet street. She looked as she always did, dignified, with a calm, thoughtful expression that seemed untouched by the chaos of the city. I approached her slowly, unsure of what I would say. But as soon as she saw me, she paused, her eyes softening with a hint of recognition. "Hello there," she said kindly, her voice gentle. "You look like you could use a bit of help." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Her kindness was so unexpected, so genuine, that it nearly overwhelmed me. I stammered out a few words, trying to explain my situation without revealing too much. I've been having some trouble lately. I don't have anywhere to stay, and I was wondering if you might know of a place where I could go." She studied me for a moment, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding that made me feel, for the first time in days, that I wasn't entirely alone. Then, she nodded slowly. "I have an extra room," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It's not much, but you're welcome to stay as long as you need." Relief flooded through me, and I thanked her, my words spilling out in a rush. She simply smiled and gestured for me to follow her. As we walked to her apartment, I felt a small spark of hope ignite within me. Maybe, just maybe, I could find some peace here, some escape from the nightmare that had overtaken my life. Her apartment was small and cozy, filled with the scent of herbs and old wood. She showed me to a modest room at the back, with a simple bed and a small window that looked out onto the street. It wasn't much, but it felt like a sanctuary, a safe haven where I could finally breathe. For the first time since I'd seen him, I felt a sliver of safety, a fragile hope that maybe things would be okay. But as I lay down that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. And somehow, I knew this peace wouldn't last. The first few days at her apartment passed quietly. I tried to keep a low profile, staying mostly in my room or helping her with small chores around the apartment. Her kindness was a balm to my frayed nerves. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry into my past. She simply accepted my presence with a gentle understanding that made me feel, for a fleeting moment, like I could trust again. But even in this peaceful setting, I couldn't relax. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see him lurking on the street, watching, waiting. His words echoed in my mind constantly, "I'll be watching." I could almost feel his gaze, a heavy, unseen presence that followed me even when I was alone. At night, sleep remained elusive. The moment I closed my eyes, I was transported back to that abandoned building, to the dark hallway and his figure in the doorway. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, my body tense with dread. The fear clung to me, a constant reminder that I was no longer safe, no matter where I went. One evening, as I was helping her prepare dinner, she noticed my hands trembling as I chopped vegetables. She reached over, her hand warm and steady on my arm, grounding me in the present. "You're safe here," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet confidence. "Whoever hurt you, they can't touch you now." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this apartment, this gentle woman, could shield me from the darkness that had invaded my life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, just waiting for the right moment to strike. I mumbled a thank you, forcing a weak smile, but she seemed to sense my unease. She didn't press further, simply giving my shoulder a comforting squeeze before continuing with the meal. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to calm my mind, repeating her words like a mantra, "You're safe here." But as the hours ticked by, my fear only grew. I could almost feel his presence, as if he were standing right outside the door, listening, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to remind me that I could never truly escape. Then, in the silence of the night, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from outside my window. My body went rigid, every nerve on edge. I held my breath, straining to listen. It could have been anything, a branch against the glass, a loose shutter. But something about the sound felt deliberate, too precise, too controlled. I slowly got out of bed, inching towards the window, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. With a trembling hand, I reached out and pulled the curtain back just a sliver. My eyes scanned the darkness outside, searching for any sign of movement. At first, I saw nothing, just the empty street, dimly lit by a single street lamp. But then, there it was. A shadow, barely visible, lingering at the edge of the light. It stood perfectly still, watching, waiting. I couldn't see his face, but I didn't need to. I knew, instinctively, that it was him. He had found me. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, my hands clutching the edge of the window ledge for support. I forced myself to breathe, to stay quiet, hoping he hadn't noticed me. But in my heart, I knew he had. He wanted me to see him, to know that no matter where I went, he would always find me. The tapping started again, a slow, deliberate rhythm that sent chills down my spine. I backed away from the window, retreating to the corner of the room, as far from him as possible. My mind raced, desperate for a plan, a way to escape. But I knew that there was no escape. Not from him. I was trapped. I stayed in the corner of my room, curled up, my arms wrapped tightly around myself as if I could somehow protect myself from the fear that was closing in on me. The tapping outside the window continued, relentless and steady, a reminder that he was still there, just beyond the thin glass, waiting for me to break. I wanted to scream, to run to her room and beg her for help. But some part of me held back, afraid that my fear would only drag her into this nightmare with me. If he was willing to track me down here, to linger in the shadows just to frighten me, then who knew what he was capable of? I couldn't risk putting her in danger. Instead, I sat there, trembling, trying to convince myself that this was all in my head, that maybe I was imagining things, letting my fear distort reality. But the tapping was so real, so sharp, cutting through the silence of the night like a knife. Eventually, it stopped, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence in its place. I held my breath, waiting, listening for any other sound. The minutes dragged on, stretching into an eternity, but there was nothing, just the empty, oppressive quiet that made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my eyes fixed on the window, watching, waiting for him to reappear. But the shadow never returned, and as the first light of dawn crept into the room, I began to wonder if he'd really been there at all. Had my mind betrayed me, twisted my fear into something more tangible, more horrifying? I didn't know. I only knew that I couldn't keep living like this, in constant terror, jumping at every sound, every flicker of movement. When morning came, I stumbled into the kitchen, my eyes bloodshot, my hands shaking. She noticed immediately, her gentle face creased with concern. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, placing a cup of tea in front of me. I forced myself to nod, taking a shaky sip of the tea. "Just didn't sleep well," I mumbled, avoiding her gaze. She studied me for a moment, and I could feel her seeing through my flimsy lie, sensing the fear that clung to me like a shadow. But, to my relief, she didn't press further. Instead, She reached out, placing a reassuring hand on my arm. "If there's anything you need, anything at all, just let me know." I nodded, managing a weak smile, but her kindness only deepened the guilt gnawing at my chest. I couldn't drag her into this. I was already trapped in a nightmare I didn't understand, and I couldn't risk pulling her into it as well. She had given me shelter, a small haven of safety, and I didn't want to shatter that for her. Over the next few days, I did my best to avoid drawing attention to myself. I tried to act normal, going through the motions, pretending that everything was fine. But the memory of that night haunted me, lingering at the edges of my mind, a constant reminder that he was still out there, watching, waiting. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows, sent a jolt of fear through me. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, my paranoia growing with each passing day. The small room that had once felt safe now felt like a prison, trapping me with my fear and uncertainty. Then, one evening, as I sat alone in the dimly lit living room, I noticed something strange. A small, folded piece of paper had been slipped under the door. I stared at it, my heart racing, fear prickling at the back of my neck. Slowly, I got up and walked over to it, my hands trembling as I picked it up. I unfolded the paper, my eyes scanning the short message scrawled in a messy, almost childlike handwriting. "I'm closer than you think." I dropped the paper, a cold wave of terror washing over me. He was taunting me, reminding me that no matter where I went, he would always be one step ahead. I stumbled back, my mind racing, panic clawing at my chest. He had found me. He was here, somewhere, watching, waiting to strike. I couldn't breathe, my vision blurring as the walls seemed to close in around me. I was trapped, with nowhere to run, no one to turn to. And I knew, deep down, that he wouldn't stop until he destroyed everything, until he'd broken me completely. I had to find a way out. But the question was, how? The note haunted me. I kept seeing the words, "I'm closer than you think," burned into my mind, repeating over and over like a cruel chant. I felt like he was in every shadow, behind every door, just waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't dare tell her about it. I didn't want to drag her into this nightmare. But the fear was becoming unbearable, like a constant weight pressing down on me. In the following days, I tried to go about my life as normally as possible, pretending that everything was fine. I helped around the apartment, shared polite conversations with her, even forced myself to go outside briefly to run errands. But each time I stepped out, I could feel eyes on me, as if he were watching from some hidden place, following my every move. One night, I woke up to a soft creak just outside my bedroom door. I froze, every muscle tense, listening intently. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that feels thick, pressing, unnatural. I strained my ears, my heart pounding as I waited for another sound. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate tap on my door, so soft that I almost thought I'd imagined it. Tap. 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 I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. The tapping continued, steady and insistent, like some twisted lullaby meant to lure me into a false sense of security. My mind raced, torn between the urge to scream and the overwhelming terror that kept me paralyzed. Finally, the tapping stopped. I stayed perfectly still, listening for any other sound, but there was only silence, thick and oppressive, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I sat there in the dark, my mind racing, the fear consuming me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too afraid to even close my eyes. When morning came, I emerged from my room, exhausted and on edge. She noticed immediately, her eyes filled with concern. "You look terrible," she said gently, offering me a warm cup of tea. "Are you sure you're all right?" I forced a smile, trying to brush off her worry. "Just haven't been sleeping well," I mumbled, avoiding her gaze. But she saw right through me. Her face softened, and she reached out, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "If you need help, you can tell me," she said softly. "Whatever's haunting you, you don't have to face it alone." Her words broke something inside me. For a moment, I wanted to tell her everything, to pour out all the fear and paranoia that had been festering inside me. But I couldn't. I couldn't put her in danger. I couldn't drag her into this horror. So, I simply nodded, offering a weak smile before retreating back to my room. The isolation was suffocating, but I didn't know how to escape it. Every moment was a balancing act, trapped between my fear of him and my fear of involving anyone else in this nightmare. That evening, I went to bed early, hoping to escape into sleep, to find some brief respite from the terror that plagued my waking hours. But as soon as I closed my eyes, I felt it, a heavy, suffocating presence in the room, watching me, waiting. I sat up, my heart racing, but the room was empty, silent. Just shadows cast by the faint moonlight filtering through the window. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling lingered, pressing down on me like a weight, filling every corner of the room. I couldn't shake the sensation that he was there, just out of sight, hidden in the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The fear was consuming me, eating away at my sanity. I was trapped, with nowhere to go, no one to turn to. And the worst part was that he knew it. He knew exactly how to torment me, to keep me constantly on edge, spiraling further and further into despair. I was beginning to wonder if I would ever feel safe again, or if he would haunt me forever, a shadow I could never escape. The days that followed were a blur of tension and sleepless nights. I was constantly on edge, every sound setting my nerves alight. The walls of the small apartment, which had once felt safe, now felt like a trap, closing in on me, cutting off any escape. Even her presence couldn't quell the creeping dread that was eating away at me from the inside. I knew he was toying with me, playing some sick game. He wanted me afraid, wanted me to feel helpless. And it was working. Every time I walked into a room, I half expected to find him waiting for me in the shadows, that unsettling grin on his face. I could almost hear his voice in my head, whispering threats, promises of what he would do once he finally got his hands on me. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the apartment, I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this. I needed to confront him, to put an end to this nightmare. Hiding and cowering wouldn't stop him. I had to face him, somehow. But I was terrified. The thought of seeing him again, of standing face to face with the monster that had been haunting me, sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't strong or brave. I was just desperate, cornered like a trapped animal with no way out. I spent hours pacing back and forth, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. What if he overpowered me? What if this was exactly what he wanted, for me to come to him willingly, to walk straight into his clutches? But then I thought of her, of how kind she'd been to me, how she'd given me shelter and safety when I had nowhere else to go. I couldn't let him ruin her life, couldn't allow him to taint the only good thing I had left. Finally, just as midnight approached, I made my way to the door. The building was quiet, shrouded in a stillness that felt almost unnatural. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and opened the door. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and silent, lit only by the faint glow of a distant street lamp filtering in through a small window at the end of the corridor. My footsteps echoed softly as I walked, each step feeling heavier, as if some unseen force was trying to pull me back, to keep me from moving forward. I wasn't even sure where I was going. All I knew was that I had to find him, to put an end to this nightmare once and for all. As I reached the end of the hallway, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned, heart hammering, and saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner, partially obscured by the darkness. It was him. I didn't need to see his face to know. I could feel his presence, the same cold, unsettling aura that had haunted my every waking moment. He was just standing there, watching me, his silhouette sharp and unnervingly still. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from him as possible. But I forced myself to stand my ground, my fists clenched, my body trembling. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The question hung in the air, met with a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, he moved, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. The dim light cast his face in shadow, but I could still make out the glint of his eyes, cold and calculating, watching me with a twisted sense of satisfaction. "You're just where I want you," he murmured, his voice low and mocking, each word dripping with malice. So predictable. Fear gripped me, paralyzing me. I felt as though I were sinking, trapped in quicksand, unable to escape his gaze. But I couldn't let him see my fear. I couldn't let him know how much power he had over me. "I'm not afraid of you," I lied, my voice shaking, betraying the terror I was trying to hide. He laughed, a dark, hollow sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Oh, but you are," he whispered, taking another step closer. "I can see it in your eyes, hear it in your voice. You're terrified." I took another step back, my mind racing, searching for some way to escape. But he was blocking the only path back, cornering me, trapping me like prey. And in that moment, I realized the horrifying truth: there was no escape. He had me exactly where he wanted me, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. He was close enough that I could see the faint, twisted smile on his face, the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He was savoring this, enjoying the fear radiating off me like heat. My body wanted to flee, to turn and run, but there was nowhere to go. Every muscle was tense, my mind racing with terror and dread. Then, out of nowhere, he took a step back, his expression shifting to something almost amused. He tilted his head, studying me as though I were some fascinating creature he'd just discovered. "Look at you," he said softly, the mockery in his voice unmistakable. "The little mouse, cornered and trembling. You must be wondering why I'm doing this. Why I chose you." I wanted to scream, to tell him to leave me alone, but my throat felt tight, my words frozen in fear. I could only stand there, staring at him, caught in his gaze like a deer in headlights. He continued, as if he hadn't noticed, or maybe he enjoyed seeing me paralyzed. "People like you think you're safe, that the world owes you some kind of kindness. But life isn't like that. Sometimes, the wolf finds the sheep, no matter how well it hides." The words cut through me like a blade, each syllable dripping with contempt. My mind raced, desperate to understand what he was saying, why he was targeting me. But the answer eluded me, slipping through my fingers like sand. What do you want from me?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice trembling, barely audible. He chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you're willing to give or lose. His eyes glinted with a predatory hunger. The real question is, how far are you willing to go to save yourself? The question hung in the air, heavy and ominous. I couldn't tell if he was taunting me or if he genuinely expected an answer. Either way, I knew that this was some kind of twisted game to him, a game where my life was just a pawn. I clenched my fists, trying to summon some shred of courage. "I'm not playing your game," I said, forcing the words out through gritted teeth. "Whatever sick thrill you're after, you won't get it from me." But he just laughed again, this time louder, as if I'd told the funniest joke he ever heard. "Oh, but you already are, my dear. You started playing the moment you noticed me." And now, he leaned in, his face so close that I could feel his breath. "Now, it's too late to stop." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared, leaving me standing alone in the dimly lit hallway, my heart racing, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I stumbled back to the apartment, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it, then double-checking the lock just to be sure. I pressed my back against the door, breathing heavily, trying to steady myself. He was gone, for now, but his words echoed in my mind, each syllable laced with menace. "It's too late to stop." The weight of those words settled over me, heavy and suffocating. I was trapped, a pawn in his twisted game, with no way out. And he knew it. He knew that no matter where I went, no matter how carefully I hid, he would find me. Over the next few days, I became a shadow of myself. I hardly ate, barely slept, jumping at every sound, every whisper of movement. She noticed, of course, her concern growing each day. But I couldn't tell her. How could I explain something like this? How could I make her understand that there was a monster lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting? One night, after another day of living in constant fear, she approached me, her face soft with worry. "I don't know what's going on," she said gently, "but you're not yourself. You look haunted." Her words cut through me. Haunted. It was exactly how I felt, like a ghost, trapped between worlds, unable to escape the nightmare that had become my reality. I wanted to tell her, to beg her for help, but the words wouldn't come. I was too afraid that if I involved her, he would target her too. So I just nodded, offering her a weak, forced smile. "I'm fine. Really. Just tired, I guess." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. She just nodded, giving me a small, sympathetic smile before retreating to her own room, leaving me alone once again with the silence, with my fear. That night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I realized the horrifying truth. I couldn't keep going like this. He was in my head, in my dreams, haunting my every waking moment. And I knew that unless I did something, unless I found a way to stop him, he would eventually break me. The thought lingered as I finally drifted into a restless sleep, the faintest glimmer of resolve forming in the back of my mind. I didn't know how or when, but one way or another, I would put an end to this. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of determination that I hadn't felt in days. It wasn't much, just a faint spark, but it was enough to get me moving. I couldn't keep living like this, cowering in fear, waiting for him to strike. If I was ever going to be free, I needed to find answers. I needed to know who he was and why he'd chosen me. I spent the day combing through my memories, trying to piece together any clues, any tiny detail I might have missed. Had I crossed paths with him before? Did I somehow bring this upon myself? But no matter how hard I thought, I couldn't recall ever meeting him until that night in the alley. His face, his voice, everything about him was foreign, as if he'd emerged from the darkness just to torment me. Desperation began to take hold as the hours passed. I felt like I was spiraling, sinking deeper into the unknown. There were so many questions, so many pieces that didn't fit. Who was he? Why was he playing this sick game? And more importantly, how could I make him stop? Late that afternoon, in a moment of clarity, I decided to do something I hadn't dared to do since this nightmare began. I reached out to her, the one person I trusted, the one person who had shown me kindness. She was in the living room, reading, when I approached her, my hand shaking, my heart pounding. She looked up as I entered, concern immediately flashing across her face. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft and caring. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, setting her book aside. I could see the worry in her eyes as she studied me, waiting patiently for me to speak. For a moment, I hesitated. Could I really tell her? Would she believe me? But I knew that I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. "There's someone after me," I said finally, the words feeling foreign on my tongue, like they belonged to someone else. "He's been following me, tormenting me. I don't know who he is or why he's doing this, but he won't leave me alone." Her eyes widened, a mixture of shock and fear flashing across her face. "What? Since when? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I looked down, ashamed. "I didn't want to involve you. I thought I could handle it. But he's everywhere. I don't feel safe anymore." She reached out, placing a comforting hand on my arm. "You're not alone," she said firmly. "We'll figure this out together. Maybe we can go to the police?" The police. The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. But as soon as she mentioned it, a sick feeling settled in my stomach. I remembered his words, the way he taunted me, how he seemed to know everything about me. Going to the police felt like stepping into his trap, like doing exactly what he wanted. I don't think that's a good idea," I said slowly, my mind racing. He's different. He knows things. He's not just some random stalker. He's calculated." She frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, struggling to put my fear into words. He's in my head. He knows what I'm thinking, where I'm going to be. It's like he's always one step ahead of me. Going to the police it would make things worse. I know it." She looked at me, her expression torn between disbelief and concern. "Are you sure? This sounds serious." "It is," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But he wants me to be afraid. He wants me to feel trapped. If I go to the police, I'll be playing right into his hands." She was silent for a moment, her gaze distant as she processed everything I'd told her. Finally, she nodded, her expression resolute. "All right. If you don't want to go to the police, we'll find another way. But you're not doing this alone. Whatever he's planning, we'll face it together." A surge of relief washed over me at her words. For the first time in days, I didn't feel completely alone. With her by my side, maybe, just maybe, I could find a way out of this nightmare. We spent the rest of the evening talking, strategizing, trying to piece together what little information we had. She suggested keeping a record of any encounters, any signs that he was nearby. Maybe, she reasoned, if we had enough information, we could find a pattern, a clue to his identity. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I had a glimmer of hope. I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The fear was still there, lurking in the shadows, but it wasn't as overwhelming as before. I had someone on my side now, someone who believed me, who was willing to help me. And that made all the difference. But as I drifted off to sleep, a faint, nagging voice whispered at the back of my mind, a warning, a reminder that he was still out there, watching, waiting. And somehow, I knew that he wouldn't take kindly to my newfound resolve. The next few days felt like walking on a knife's edge. Every sound, every movement outside the apartment set my nerves on high alert. I started avoiding windows, pulling the curtains tightly shut, my eyes constantly darting around the room as if he could emerge from any corner. She noticed my behavior, of course, but she didn't say anything. She simply stayed close, reassuring me with her presence. It was a small comfort in an ocean of dread. Together, we began documenting everything. Any sign, any trace of him that we could find. Every note was meticulously recorded, every tiny detail examined. Yet, no matter how hard we looked, it was as if he vanished. It should have made me feel safe. But deep down, I knew better. He wasn't gone. He was simply waiting. Then one night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, a faint tapping, so soft that at first, I thought it was just the wind. But then it came again, more deliberate, each tap echoing in the silent apartment. My heart raced as I strained to listen, trying to locate the source of the sound. It was coming from the window. I froze, the memory of his mocking smile flashing through my mind. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't real. But curiosity, or maybe some twisted sense of defiance, got the better of me. I pushed myself out of bed, each step slow and cautious, barely daring to breathe as I approached the window. With trembling hands, I reached for the edge of the curtain, pulling it back just enough to see outside. My heart stopped. There, in the dim light, was a message scratched into the window, faint but unmistakable. I'm always watching. A shiver ran down my spine, cold and paralyzing. He'd been here, right outside my window, close enough to reach out and touch. The thought made me feel sick, a wave of nausea rising as I stumbled back, my mind reeling. He wasn't just following me. He was taunting me, daring me to react. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream, my mind racing with fear and panic. How long had he been watching? How often had he come to my window, unseen, leaving no trace? I staggered back, feeling the walls closing in, my vision blurring with terror. Just then, she appeared in the doorway, her face filled with concern. What happened? Are you okay? She asked, hurrying over as she noticed my ashen face. I couldn't find the words. I could only point to the window, my hand shaking uncontrollably. She followed my gaze, her expression darkening as she took in the message. For a moment, she was silent, her face hardening with anger and determination. We're not letting him win, she said, her voice steady, resolute. This is exactly what he wants, for you to be afraid. But we're going to fight this. We're going to make sure he never comes near you again. Her words were like a lifeline, grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. She held my gaze, her expression fierce, unyielding, and for a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing with us, that no matter what we did, he was always one step ahead. The message on the window felt like a warning, a reminder that he was in control, that he could reach me whenever he wanted. And there was nothing I could do to stop him. That night, sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his twisted smile, the cold gleam in his eyes. I lay awake, my mind racing with fear and dread, wondering how long I could keep going before he finally made his move. In the days that followed, the tension only grew. We tried to go about our lives as if everything was normal, but the fear was always there, lurking in the background. Every time I stepped outside, I felt his presence, a shadow following me, watching, waiting. It was a constant, suffocating weight, pressing down on me, filling every corner of my mind. She tried to stay positive, encouraging me, reminding me that we were in this together. But I could see the worry in her eyes, the exhaustion creeping into her face. I wasn't the only one affected by this nightmare. She was suffering too, caught in the web of fear and uncertainty that he'd spun around us. One evening, as we sat together in silence, I couldn't help but wonder what his endgame was. Was this all just a game to him, a twisted form of entertainment? Or did he have a darker purpose, some horrifying plan that I hadn't yet uncovered? The uncertainty gnawed at me, driving me to the edge of my sanity. I needed answers. I needed to understand what he wanted, why he was tormenting me, haunting my every step. But the only one who could give me those answers was the very person I was trying to escape. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, he made his move. It happened on a quiet night, when the silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the faint hum of the city outside. I was lying awake, as usual, my mind replaying every unsettling detail of the last few weeks. The message on the window, his taunting words, the feeling that he was always just beyond my reach but close enough to strike at any moment. Sleep was a distant memory now, replaced by a state of constant, exhausting vigilance. And then, I heard it, a noise so subtle, so soft, that at first I thought I imagined it. A faint, almost rhythmic scratching, like nails running along a surface. My heart lurched as I sat up, straining to listen, my pulse pounding in my ears. The sound was coming from the hallway, growing louder, inching closer. I forced myself out of bed, my hands shaking as I reached for anything I could use to defend myself, a lamp, a chair, anything. But in the back of my mind, I knew it was useless. He wasn't coming to hurt me, not physically. No, he wanted something else, my fear, my surrender. And he was getting exactly what he wanted. As I crept towards the door, the scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it was right outside. I held my breath, my hand hovering over the doorknob, torn between the desperate urge to confront him and the overwhelming terror of what I might find. But before I could make a decision, the noise stopped, leaving me in suffocating silence. A moment passed. Then another. My mind raced, my senses on high alert, waiting for the next move. And then, as if mocking my hesitation, a piece of paper was slid under the door, its edges curling up, a stark white against the dark floor. I stared at it, my heart pounding, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I didn't want to pick it up, didn't want to know what it said. But I couldn't resist. With trembling hands, I reached down, my fingers brushing against the paper as I lifted it to read his latest message. In bold, sharp letters, written with an almost mechanical precision, were the words, "You can't hide forever." A chill ran down my spine, cold and paralyzing. The message was simple, almost mundane, but it carried a weight that pressed down on me, crushing my resolve. He was right outside. He knew where I was, and he was reminding me that escape was impossible. I stumbled back, the paper slipping from my fingers as I backed away from the door. Panic surged through me, overwhelming every rational thought, every shred of courage I managed to cling to. He was closer than ever, closing in, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear, my mind a whirlwind of terror and desperation. But eventually, I felt a hand on my shoulder, grounding me, pulling me back from the edge. It was her face etched with worry as she took in my pale, shaking form. "What's going on?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if she was afraid of drawing his attention. I didn't have the words to explain. I could only gesture to the paper on the floor, hoping she would understand. She picked it up, her face hardening as she read the message. For a moment, she was silent, her gaze distant, thoughtful. "We can't keep living like this," she said finally, her voice steady, resolved. "He's not going to stop. We need to do something." I shook my head, fear clouding my thoughts. "What can we do? He's everywhere. He knows everything. Going to the police won't help. It'll only make things worse." She looked at me, her eyes fierce, unwavering. "Then we have to outsmart him. If he wants to play games, we'll play. But our terms." Her confidence was a lifeline, pulling me back from the abyss. She had a plan, or at least the beginnings of one, and it was enough to give me a sliver of hope. Together, we started brainstorming, searching for any advantage we could find, any weakness we could exploit. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the hours passed, a plan began to take shape, a risky, desperate plan that might be our only chance. We would lure him out, force him into the open, make him reveal himself. It was dangerous, reckless even, but we were out of options. It was a gamble, a final stand against the terror that had consumed our lives. And so, we prepared. We laid out our strategy, rehearsing every step, every contingency. She would be my anchor, guiding me, keeping me grounded, while I drew him out, exposing his hand. It was a terrifying prospect, but the alternative, continuing to live in fear, under his control, was even worse. That night, as we sat together, going over the plan one last time, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but it was tempered by determination, by the knowledge that I was no longer powerless. We were ready. Our plan was simple, yet dangerous. It was a risk, but I knew we didn't have a choice. If we kept hiding, if we kept running, he'd always be there, lurking in the shadows, tormenting me. We had to take control, even if it meant stepping into his twisted game. The following night, we set everything in motion. The apartment was quiet, every light turned off to blend into the darkness. She had her role, keeping watch from a hidden corner, phone in hand, ready to call for help if things spiraled out of control. My role was to be the bait, to lure him out, to make him believe he'd won, that I was helpless, isolated, and easy to trap. I sat by the window, my gaze fixed on the empty street below, waiting, my heart pounding with each passing second. The plan relied on him taking the bait, on him believing I was completely alone. We practiced every scenario, every possible response, but nothing could prepare me for the overwhelming dread that settled in my chest as I waited, alone in the darkness. Minutes turned into hours, the silence thick and suffocating. My mind began to race, doubts creeping in, whispering fears and uncertainties. What if he didn't take the bait? What if he saw through our plan, or worse, what if he decided to turn the tables on us, to outsmart us? I tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on my breathing, reminding myself that this was the only way. And then, just as I was beginning to lose hope, I heard it, a faint rustling, barely audible, coming from the hallway outside the door. My pulse quickened, fear surging through me as I forced myself to stay calm, to stay focused. This was it. He was here. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, hoping he'd believe I was oblivious to his presence, vulnerable, an easy target. The sound grew louder, closer, each step echoing in the silence, drawing nearer until it stopped just outside the door. I could feel his presence, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The door handle turned, slow and deliberate, the creak of the metal sending a shiver down my spine. I held my breath, every muscle tense, my mind racing as I waited for the door to swing open, for him to step inside. And then, just as he crossed the threshold, I hit the switch, flooding the room with blinding light. He froze, caught off guard, his face momentarily exposed in the harsh glare. He looked exactly as I remembered him, calm, calculating, a cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. But there was a flicker of surprise, a brief moment where his mask slipped, revealing a hint of uncertainty. Without hesitation, I called out, my voice steady despite the fear twisting inside me. "It's over. You don't control me anymore." He smirked, regaining his composure, a dark, mocking glint in his eyes. "You really think this changes anything? You think you're safe?" But I stood my ground, refusing to let him see my fear. "You're the one who's been exposed. We have everything, the messages, the evidence. It's all here, and it's going to the police." For the first time, I saw a crack in his confidence, a flicker of doubt as he processed my words. He took a step back, his gaze flickering to the door, calculating his next move. I knew he was weighing his options, deciding whether to stay and confront me or cut his losses and flee. But before he could make his decision, she stepped out of the shadows, her phone held up, recording every moment. His eyes widened, a flash of anger crossing his face as he realized he'd been trapped. She had captured everything, his face, his threats, every detail needed to finally end this nightmare. "You're finished," she said, her voice calm, unyielding. "The police will have everything they need to put you away for good." He glared at us, his expression twisted with rage and frustration, but there was nothing he could do. We had outsmarted him, turned his own game against him. And for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes, a fear that mirrored my own, the realization that he'd lost control, that his power over us was finally broken. Without another word, he turned and fled, disappearing into the night, leaving us alone in the silence. We stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened, the adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by a sense of relief, of freedom. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. Or so I thought. As the days passed, the fear slowly began to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism, a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, I could start to rebuild my life. She stayed by my side, her presence a constant reminder that I wasn't alone, that I had survived, that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. But in the back of my mind, a lingering doubt remained, a small, insistent voice that whispered in the quiet moments, reminding me that he was still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the fear never truly went away. Because deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning. The predator may have been driven back into the shadows, but he was still there, lurking, biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, I would be ready. In the days following that night, a fragile sense of calm settled over me. I had taken steps to secure my apartment, new locks, security cameras, anything that could offer a sense of protection. She and I had gone to the police with our recordings, our evidence, and they assured us that they would investigate, that they would do everything in their power to track him down. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. But part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this was just an illusion. I found myself jumping at small sounds, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. Every time I left my apartment, I scanned the streets, expecting to see him lurking around a corner, waiting, watching. It was as if he had left a stain on my life, a shadow that followed me everywhere I went. The first night back on my own was the hardest. She stayed with me as long as she could, promising she'd come by often, that she'd always be a call away if I needed her. But eventually, she had to leave, and I was left alone with the silence, with the memories of that night replaying over and over in my mind. I tried to sleep, tried to convince myself that I was safe, that he was gone. But as soon as I closed my eyes, I could see his face, that cold, predatory look that had haunted me for so long. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what he might be planning, of what he might do next. It was as if he had etched himself into my thoughts, an invisible presence that I couldn't escape. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off, my phone buzzed. I reached for it, my heart pounding, half expecting it to be another message from him, another taunt to remind me that he was still out there. But when I looked at the screen, it was a notification from the security camera I'd installed outside my door. Someone was there. I felt a chill run down my spine as I opened the app, my fingers trembling as I waited for the live feed to load. The screen flickered to life, showing the empty hallway outside my door. I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat, waiting, watching, searching for any sign of movement. And then, just as I was beginning to relax, I saw it, a shadow shifting at the edge of the frame, a figure moving just out of sight, lurking in the darkness. My heart pounded, fear surging through me as I watched, unable to look away. The figure lingered there for a moment, just beyond the camera's view, as if aware of its presence, taunting me with his nearness. And then, slowly, deliberately, he stepped into the frame, his face hidden in shadow, his gaze fixed on the camera, on me. I froze, my mind racing, every muscle in my body tensing as I watched him, unable to process what I was seeing. He shouldn't be here. He was supposed to be gone, hiding, running from the police. But here he was, standing just outside my door, as if nothing had changed, as if the last few days had been nothing more than a game to him. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of paper. With a smirk, he held it up to the camera, letting me see the bold, sharp letters scrawled across the page. "Miss me?" A wave of nausea washed over me, my vision blurring as I stared at the message, my mind reeling with disbelief. He was taunting me, mocking my efforts to escape, to move on. It was as if he was reminding me that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried to protect myself, he would always be there, a shadow I could never outrun. I stumbled back, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone, desperate to call her, to hear her voice, to know that I wasn't alone in this nightmare. But just as I was about to dial her number, the screen went dark, the feed cutting off, leaving me in silence, in darkness. Panic surged through me, my mind racing with questions, with fears. Had he cut the power? Was he trying to break in? I checked the locks, double-checking each one, my hands trembling as I went through the motions, trying to reassure myself, trying to believe that I was safe. But deep down, I knew the truth. No lock, no camera, no police report would keep him away. He was a predator, a master of the shadows, and he had set his sights on me. I was trapped, caught in his web, and no matter how hard I tried to escape, he would always be there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And as I sat there, alone in the silence, the full weight of my situation settled over me. This wasn't over. It would never be over. Because he wasn't just a man, he was the embodiment of fear itself, a relentless presence that would haunt me for as long as I lived. I was his prey. And he wasn't done with me yet. The next morning, I was a shell of myself. I hadn't slept at all, every creak and whisper of the apartment filling me with dread, making me feel like he was just beyond the walls, watching and waiting. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the curtains, I felt an ounce of relief, but it was tainted by the deep exhaustion that had settled into my bones. She came over as soon as I called her, sensing the urgency in my voice. As soon as she saw me, her expression changed, her usual calm, supportive demeanor replaced by concern and fear. She listened in silence as I told her about the message, about the figure lurking in the hallway, about the sense that he was always one step ahead, always there, in the shadows, taunting me. "Are you sure it was him?" she asked gently, though I could tell by the look in her eyes that she already knew the answer. I nodded, clutching the phone in my hands. It was him. I saw him. He knows I can't escape. It's like he's enjoying this, like he's feeding off my fear. She squeezed my hand, her expression fierce, protective. "We're not going to let him win. We'll go to the police again. We'll make them understand that he's still a threat, that he's still out there." But as she spoke, a terrible thought crept into my mind, a thought that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. What if the police couldn't stop him? What if they didn't believe me? After all, he was a master of manipulation, of blending in, of hiding in plain sight. He could disappear whenever he wanted, reappear whenever it suited him. He was like a shadow, slipping through the cracks of reality, impossible to catch. Still, she convinced me to go back to the police station. We spent hours there, going over every detail, showing them the footage, recounting every message, every incident. I watched their faces, hoping for a flicker of understanding, a sign that they grasped the gravity of the situation. But their expressions remained neutral, professional, their responses clipped and polite. "We're doing everything we can," one of the officers said, his tone flat and unconvincing. "But without a clear and immediate threat, it's difficult to prioritize resources. We'll keep an eye out, and if he makes any further contact, let us know." I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him understand that this wasn't just some nuisance, that my life was being torn apart, piece by piece. But instead, I nodded, forcing myself to remain calm, to hold back the anger, the desperation. I knew that losing control wouldn't help, that it would only make me look unstable, irrational. As we left the station, she tried to comfort me, to reassure me that things would get better, that eventually he'd slip up, make a mistake, and the police would catch him. But I could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear that mirrored my own. We both knew that he was too clever, too careful to let himself be caught so easily. Over the next few days, I tried to regain some semblance of normalcy, to convince myself that I could still live my life, that I could still find peace. But he was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that my safety was an illusion. Then, one evening, as I returned home, I found a note waiting for me, slipped under the door. My heart skipped a beat as I picked it up, unfolding the paper with trembling hands. The words were simple, written in a neat, controlled script. "Miss me?" The same mocking phrase from before, the same twisted taunt that had haunted me since that night. But this time, there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. Attached to the note was a small photo, a picture of me, taken just that morning as I left my apartment. He was watching me. Every move, every step, every moment of my day was under his gaze, his silent, unyielding presence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I staggered back, my mind racing, fear tightening its grip on my chest. I felt trapped, caged in my own life, every familiar place transformed into a hunting ground, every moment tainted by his shadow. That night, I called her again, my voice barely more than a whisper as I told her about the note, about the photo, about the suffocating terror that had taken hold of me. She listened patiently, her voice soft and soothing, but I could hear the fear in her words, the uncertainty that had begun to creep into her mind as well. "We'll figure this out," she said, trying to sound confident. "We'll find a way to end this." But even as she spoke, I could feel the hopelessness settling over me, the sinking realization that there was no way out, that he had woven himself into my life, into my thoughts, into every corner of my mind. He wasn't just a man, he was a force, an unstoppable, relentless presence that would haunt me for as long as I lived. I lay awake that night, staring into the darkness, waiting for sleep that never came. Every sound, every shadow seemed to carry his presence, his silent, mocking laughter echoing in the back of my mind. In the end, there was only one thought that brought me any semblance of comfort, any fleeting sense of control. If he wanted me, if he was determined to turn my life into his twisted game, then I would fight. I would stand my ground. I wouldn't let him reduce me to a helpless, terrified victim. But as I drifted into a restless, haunted sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I fought, he would always be there, lurking just beyond my reach, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And the worst part was that deep down, a part of me knew that he enjoyed it, that he was savoring every moment, every ounce of fear he could wring from me. This was a game to him, a game that he had no intention of ending. The following days blurred into a haze of paranoia and exhaustion. Each morning I found myself cautiously checking every corner, every shadow as if he would somehow materialize out of thin air. I barely left my apartment, the walls beginning to feel more like a prison than a sanctuary. And yet, the thought of stepping outside, of walking through the city knowing he could be there, watching, was more than I could bear. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his presence, his cold, unblinking gaze piercing through the darkness. My dreams were filled with shadows, with whispers of his voice taunting me, reminding me that no matter where I went, he would always find me. Even in sleep, I couldn't escape him. And then, one night, I heard it, a soft tapping sound, like fingers gently drumming against glass. My heart froze as I lay in bed, straining to listen, every nerve in my body on high alert. The sound was coming from the window. For a moment, I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. I knew it couldn't be him. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, and there was no balcony, no ledge for anyone to stand on. But the sound persisted, a steady, rhythmic tapping that grew louder, more insistent, as if he were taunting me, daring me to come closer. With a trembling hand, I reached for my phone, the screen casting an eerie glow in the darkness. I opened the security camera app, pulling up the feed from outside my door, my heart pounding as I waited for the image to load. Nothing. The hallway was empty, silent, undisturbed. But the tapping continued, each tap like a pulse in the night, a heartbeat that echoed my own. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to sit up, to move, to confront whatever waited beyond the shadows. Slowly, I crept towards the window, each step feeling like a journey through a nightmare. My mind raced, filled with images of his face, his mocking smile, the cold glint in his eyes as he watched me, as he waited for the perfect moment to strike. I reached the window, my fingers shaking as I pulled back the curtain, bracing myself for whatever lay on the other side. But when I looked out, there was nothing. The street below was empty, bathed in a dim glow of streetlights, casting long, twisted shadows across the pavement. I exhaled, a mixture of relief and dread washing over me. Had it been my imagination? A trick of my exhausted mind, conjuring terrors where none existed? And then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it, a small piece of paper taped to the outside of the window, fluttering gently in the breeze. My blood ran cold as I stared at it, the familiar handwriting glaring back at me, taunting me with the same chilling message. I'm closer than you think. I stumbled back, my heart racing, fear clawing at my chest. He had been here. Somehow, he had found a way to reach me, to bypass every lock, every barrier I had put up. He had left his mark, a reminder that no matter how safe I thought I was, he could reach me whenever he wanted. Desperation drove me to call her, my voice trembling as I told her about the note, about the tapping, about the suffocating terror that had become my life. She arrived within minutes, her face pale, her eyes wide with concern as she listened to my story, trying to piece together the fragments of my shattered reality. We can't keep living like this, she said finally, her voice steady but laced with fear. He's playing with you, feeding off your fear. The more you react, the more satisfaction he gets. I knew she was right, but it felt impossible. How could I ignore him when he was always there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting? How could I pretend he didn't exist when he was so deeply entwined in every corner of my life? But her presence gave me a sliver of courage, a small spark of resistance against the darkness that had consumed me. Together, we spent hours reinforcing the apartment, checking every lock, every window, every possible entry point. We talked to the building manager, demanding additional security measures, refusing to take no for an answer. For a brief, fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we had done enough. That I could finally reclaim some sense of normalcy, some semblance of control over my life. But as I lay in bed that night, the silence pressing down on me like a weight, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, lurking just beyond my reach, his presence an invisible stain that tainted everything I held dear. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off, my phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a new message, a message from an unknown number. My heart pounded as I opened it, my hands shaking as I read the words that appeared on the screen. You think you can escape me? I stared at the message, my mind racing, fear surging through me as I tried to process what it meant. How had he found my number? How was he still able to reach me, even after all the precautions I had taken? But before I could respond, before I could think, another message appeared. I'm closer than you'll ever know. My heart pounded, my vision blurring as I stared at the screen, my mind reeling with the implications. He was here, closer than I had ever realized, his presence a constant, unrelenting force that I could never escape. And in that moment, I knew that he wasn't just toying with me, he was consuming me, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the person I used to be. I was his prey, caught in his web, and no matter how hard I tried to escape, he would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The realization settled over me like a shroud, a cold, suffocating weight that I couldn't shake. He had won. He had taken everything from me, my peace, my security, my sense of self. And as I lay there, paralyzed by fear, I knew that there was only one way this would end. One of us would have to break. And somehow, deep down, I knew that it would be me. Days and nights began to bleed together in an endless cycle of dread. I couldn't go anywhere without feeling his presence, a shadow that lingered just at the edge of my vision, always watching, always waiting. The phone messages kept coming, relentless and haunting, each one more unnerving than the last. They weren't just words, they were threats, subtle and twisted reminders that no matter what I did, I was never truly alone. "Alice, your friend," one message read, and I felt my blood run cold as I realized he knew about her. Somehow, he had been watching, listening, monitoring every desperate attempt I had made to regain control. It was as if he were a step ahead of me, predicting my moves, anticipating my every thought. I stopped sleeping, each moment a relentless battle to keep my sanity intact. My apartment transformed from a safe haven into a labyrinth of nightmares, every creak and shadow reminding me of his proximity. I thought about running, about leaving everything behind and disappearing into some far corner of the world. But I knew he would find me. He always did. One evening, just as the last light was fading from the sky, I heard a knock on the door. It was soft, almost polite, yet filled with a malice that made my skin crawl. My heart raced, fear pulsing through me as I stood frozen in place, listening. Another knock, insistent this time, as if he were growing impatient. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I moved towards the door, peeking through the peephole. But the hallway was empty, silent and undisturbed, as if the knock had been a figment of my imagination. I pulled back, breathing heavily, every instinct screaming at me to run. And then my phone buzzed with a new message. I opened it with trembling hands, dread pooling in my stomach as I read the words. "I know you're there. Open the door." I felt my knees weaken, the terror settling deep within me. He was out there, waiting, taunting me with his presence, playing a game that only he understood. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, trapped in a prison of fear that he had carefully constructed around me. In a panic, I called her, my voice barely a whisper as I told her what had happened. She arrived minutes later, her face pale but determined as she stepped into my apartment, her presence a brief, fleeting comfort in the suffocating darkness. "We need to end this," she said firmly, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "He's not going to stop until he's taken everything from you. We have to find a way to turn the tables, to show him that he can't keep doing this." I looked at her, desperation flickering in my eyes. "But how?" "He's always there, always watching. No matter what I do, he finds a way in." She placed a hand on my shoulder, her gaze steady. "We fight back. We make him realize that he's not the only one who knows how to play this game." Together, we devised a plan, a desperate, last-ditch effort to regain control of my life. It was risky, filled with uncertainty, but it was the only option left. We set up cameras, recording every angle, every shadow, determined to catch him in the act. We left subtle traps, clues that only he would recognize, bait to lure him out of the shadows. Hours passed, each one dragging on like an eternity as we waited, listening for any sign of his presence. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on us as we sat together in the dark, our breaths shallow, our nerves frayed. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, we heard it, a faint creak, barely audible, but enough to send a chill down my spine. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I glanced at her, our eyes meeting in a silent exchange of terror and resolve. Slowly, cautiously, we checked the cameras, scanning each feed for any sign of movement. And then, in the grainy darkness, we saw him, a figure standing just outside my door, his face hidden in shadow, his posture eerily still, like a predator waiting to pounce. My heart pounded, fear and anger mixing in a volatile cocktail as I watched him, every muscle in my body tense with anticipation. This was it, The moment we had been waiting for, the chance to finally confront the monster that had haunted my life. But as we watched, he did something unexpected. He reached out, gently placing a single white flower, a lily, on the floor in front of my door. And then he turned, disappearing into the shadows as silently as he had come, leaving only the flower as a twisted reminder of his presence. I stared at the screen, my mind racing as I tried to understand the message he was sending. The lily, a symbol of death, of finality. It was as if he were telling me that this was only the beginning, that he would return, that he would never truly be gone. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to go to the police. This is evidence, proof that he's been here, that he's stalking you. They can't ignore this." But deep down, I knew that no matter how many reports we filed, no matter how many cameras we set up, he would always find a way back. He was a part of me now, a shadow that I could never fully escape. And as we sat there, surrounded by the silence and the darkness, I realized that this game was far from over. He was still out there, lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And I knew that when he did, there would be no escape. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't erase the image of that single white lily left outside my door. It felt like a twisted message, a symbol that this stalker wasn't just playing games with me, but believed he held the power over life and death itself, a silent judge deciding when my time would come. After that incident, I didn't leave my apartment for days. Every little sound made me jump, and every shadow on the wall seemed like it was hiding something sinister. She, my only friend and ally in this nightmare, stayed with me through it all. We hardly spoke, but her presence was the only thing keeping me from unraveling completely. Just as we planned, we reported everything to the police. The police listened to our story, taking notes with polite but skeptical expressions. They didn't understand. How could they? To them, it was just another case, another paranoid report from someone too afraid to face the shadows. They promised to increase patrols in my area and advised me to stay alert, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The white lily, the haunting messages, it was all a calculated design, one that wouldn't be deterred by mere patrols. Returning home felt like walking back into a trap. Every creak in the hallway, every flickering light made me feel like he was there, waiting. I kept my phone close, obsessively checking the cameras we'd installed around my apartment. But the screens only showed empty halls and quiet staircases, the silence as menacing as the unknown threat lurking beyond them. Days passed, and a tense calm settled over me. Part of me almost wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had finally lost interest. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The lily wasn't a farewell, it was a promise. And then, one night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway outside my door. My heart pounded, fear crashing over me like a tidal wave. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking as I pulled up the camera feed. There he was. There he was, standing just outside my door. The dim lighting from the hallway cast long shadows over his figure, obscuring his face but revealing his posture, tall, confident, almost relaxed, as if he were a friend waiting patiently for me to invite him in. But there was nothing friendly about the way he stood. He was a statue of menace, motionless, every fiber of his being a silent threat. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just remained there, a phantom presence on the other side of the door. I knew he was watching, listening. I could almost feel his eyes piercing through the door, staring right at me, aware of every trembling breath, every beat of my racing heart. My mind raced. What was he waiting for? What did he want? If he truly intended to hurt me, he could have done it already, countless times. But this was different. This was psychological torture, a game meticulously designed to break me down, piece by piece, until I was nothing but a shell of fear and paranoia. I could feel it happening, the walls of my sanity crumbling under the weight of his silent threat. A loud knock shattered the silence, reverberating through the walls like a gunshot. I jumped, my phone slipping from my grip and landing on the bed. I forced myself to breathe, fighting the terror that threatened to paralyze me. Another knock followed, slower, more deliberate this time. He was toying with me, feeding off my fear. Every instinct screamed at me to hide, to make myself as small and invisible as possible. But then, as quickly as the knocking had started, it stopped. I grabbed my phone again, my hands trembling as I stared at the feed. He was still there, but now he had something in his hand. At first, I couldn't make it out, the shadows distorting the object into something alien and unrecognizable. But then he moved, holding it up to the camera so I could see it clearly. It was another flower, a white lily, identical to the one he'd left before. But this time, the petals were smeared with something dark, something that looked disturbingly like blood. My stomach twisted as I stared at the flower, the symbolic message sinking in. This wasn't just a threat. It was a countdown, a warning that he was growing closer, more desperate, and that soon he would cross that final boundary. I felt a surge of nausea, a cold sweat breaking out over my skin. He was taunting me, pushing me to the edge. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I knew no one would hear. No one would come. I was alone, trapped in this nightmare with only a locked door and a flimsy camera feed separating me from the monster lurking outside. I considered calling her, my friend who had been there through all of this. But a sickening thought held me back. What if he was watching her, too? What if dragging her into this any further would only make her a target? I couldn't bear the thought of him turning his attention toward her, of her becoming entangled in this web of fear and obsession that he had spun around me. The minutes dragged on, each one an eternity as I sat there, paralyzed, waiting for his next move. But he did nothing. He just stood there, watching, the bloodied lily clutched in his hand, his silence more terrifying than any words he could have spoken. And then, as if deciding that he had his fill of my fear for the night, he lowered the flower, turned, and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded into nothing. I waited, my whole body tense, straining to hear any sign of his return. But the apartment was silent, the world outside quiet and indifferent, as if none of it had happened. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging through me, my mind reeling from the encounter. But even as I tried to process what had just happened, a terrifying realization settled over me. He would be back. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning of whatever twisted game he was playing, a game that he was winning effortlessly. And I was left alone in the silence, trapped in a prison of fear that he had so meticulously built around me. The night stretched on, an endless sea of darkness and dread. I barely slept, every noise in the apartment sending me into a panic, every creak of the floorboards making me fear that he returned. Morning light eventually filtered through the blinds, but it did little to chase away the shadows lurking in my mind. When she arrived later that day, her face full of concern, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words felt hollow, insufficient to capture the horror of the previous night. She listened, her expression shifting from fear to anger, her resolve hardening as I told her about the bloodied lily. "We have to do something," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and determination. "We can't just wait for him to come back. We need to take control, to find a way to turn the tables on him." I nodded, but deep down, I felt a crushing sense of hopelessness. This man, whoever he was, had proven that he could reach me whenever he wanted, that there was no lock, no door, no wall that could keep him out. He was relentless, an unstoppable force that seemed to thrive on my fear, feeding off my vulnerability like a parasite. But she wasn't giving up. She insisted that we call the police again, to report the latest incident, to demand action. I knew it was futile. They brushed us off before, and they'd likely do it again. But I had no other options, no other hope, so I agreed. The officer who answered sounded weary, disinterested, as if my story were just another inconvenience in his day. I tried to explain the significance of the bloody flower, the horror of the stalker's silent threat, but he responded with the same practiced platitudes, the same empty reassurances that they'd look into it and keep an eye out. After I hung up, the frustration in her eyes was clear. She wanted justice, action, something to stop this madness. But I knew that no one was coming to save us, that we were on our own in this battle against an unseen, unstoppable force. As the day wore on, her frustration turned into determination. She suggested that we confront him directly, set a trap to catch him in the act, to prove to the world that he was real, that he was a threat. The idea terrified me, but the alternative, living in constant fear, waiting for him to strike, was unbearable. We spent hours planning, discussing every detail, every possibility, crafting a scheme that we hoped would finally reveal him for what he was. It was risky, reckless even, but desperation had pushed us beyond the limits of caution. That night, as we waited in the darkened apartment, the air thick with anticipation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far beyond our control. Every instinct screamed at me to abandon the plan, to run as far away as possible, but it was too late for that now. We were committed, trapped in the final stages of a game that he had orchestrated from the start. And as midnight approached, as the shadows deepened and the silence grew heavier, I felt the chilling certainty that tonight would be the end, one way or another. The room was dark, every light extinguished to avoid giving away our presence. My friend and I sat in silence, hidden from view, our plan ready to spring into action at the first sign of him. We positioned a series of mirrors around the room, angled carefully to give us a clear view of the door without having to leave our hiding spot. The idea was simple. If he came, if he dared to enter, we'd capture his face, his movements, every piece of evidence we needed to prove he was real. Time passed agonizingly slowly, each second stretching out, our tension building like a coiled spring. I clutched my phone tightly, prepared to call the police at the slightest sound. My friend sat beside me, her hand resting on my shoulder in a silent show of solidarity. We were united in our fear, but also in our determination. This was our last stand, our only shot at ending this nightmare. The minutes turned into hours, and I began to doubt that he would come at all. Perhaps he'd sensed our trap, or maybe he was toying with us again, waiting for us to let our guard down before making his move. My muscles were tense, aching from staying in the same position for so long, but I didn't dare to move. Even breathing felt like it might shatter the silence, like any sound might reveal our presence and ruin everything. And then, just as my exhaustion began to outweigh my fear, I heard it, the soft, almost imperceptible creak of a floorboard in the hallway. My heart leapt into my throat, my hand tightening around my phone as I held my breath, every fiber of my being focused on the sound. Another creak followed, closer this time, followed by the faintest hint of footsteps. He was here. The doorknob rattled slightly, as if he were testing it, making sure it was unlocked. My friend tensed beside me, her grip on my shoulder tightening as we both watched the door, our breaths shallow, our eyes wide with terror. The doorknob twisted slowly, agonizingly, and then the door creaked open, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. A figure slipped into the room, his outline barely visible in the shadows. He moved with a quiet, calculated grace, his every movement careful, precise, as though he knew exactly where to step to avoid making any sound. My pulse raced as I watched him, the reality of his presence more horrifying than any nightmare. He stepped further into the room, closer to the spot we'd rigged with the mirrors, completely unaware that he was walking right into our trap. The faint glow from the streetlight outside illuminated his face for a brief moment, and I saw him, truly saw him, for the first time. His features were cold, almost expressionless, a mask of calm cruelty that sent a chill down my spine. There was nothing remotely human in his gaze, only a chilling detachment that hinted at the depths of his malice. My friend, her breathing shallow but controlled, shifted slightly beside me, adjusting her angle to keep him in view. I could see the determination in her eyes, the same unyielding resolve that had driven her to face this monster head-on. She gave me a small nod, a silent signal that we were ready to spring into action. But then, something unexpected happened. He stopped, his head tilting slightly, as if he sensed he was being watched. His eyes scanned the room, and for a heart-stopping moment, they landed on the mirror closest to us. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay still, to remain hidden. His gaze lingered on the mirror, his eyes narrowing as a faint smile played at the corners of his mouth. He knew. My stomach dropped as the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He'd known about the trap all along and anticipated our every move. This entire time, he'd been one step ahead, leading us exactly where he wanted us. I felt a surge of panic, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to think of a way out, a way to escape before he closed in. Without warning, he moved, his hand reaching out with startling speed, shattering the mirror with a single, violent strike. The sound of glass breaking filled the room, sharp and jarring, shattering the oppressive silence and sending shards flying across the floor. My friend stifled a gasp, her hand gripping my arm tightly as we both scrambled backward, our cover blown, our trap turned against us. He turned toward us, his eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction, a predator's gaze locked onto his prey. The mask of calm cruelty he'd worn moments before had melted away, replaced by something darker, something far more terrifying, a hunger, a savage intensity that told me we were out of time. I fumbled with my phone, my fingers clumsy and shaking as I tried to dial the police, but he was faster. In a flash, he closed the distance between us, his shadow looming over me, his face contorted into a smile that was both triumphant and terrifying. I could feel the cold air around him, the stench of malice that clung to him like a second skin. "Did you really think you could trap me?" His voice was low, mocking, dripping with a twisted amusement. He leaned closer, his eyes boring into mine, drinking in my fear like it was the very thing that sustained him. I was paralyzed, unable to look away, trapped under his gaze like a rabbit caught in the glare of an oncoming car. But my friend wasn't frozen. With a sudden burst of courage, she lunged forward, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy bookend from the shelf beside us, and swung it with all her might. The sound of impact echoed through the room, a sharp, brutal crack as the bookend connected with his shoulder. He staggered back, his expression shifting from amusement to rage, his gaze turning dark and furious. "Run!" she screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me to my feet. We bolted, not waiting to see if he would recover, not daring to look back. My heart pounded as we stumbled out of the apartment, the hallway stretching out before us like a lifeline, the promise of escape just within reach. We sprinted down the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the empty building, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Behind us, I could hear him, his footsteps growing closer, faster, the relentless sound of a predator closing in on his prey. We burst through the front door and into the night, the cold air biting into our skin as we ran, our desperation pushing us forward, our fear driving us to escape the nightmare that had consumed our lives. The city streets were empty, silent, the world oblivious to the horror unfolding just a few feet away. We kept running, the adrenaline fueling our flight, until we reached a crowded street filled with people, with witnesses, our salvation. But even as we slowed, gasping for breath, glancing over our shoulders to make sure he hadn't followed, a chilling realization settled over me. We may have escaped for now, but this wasn't over. He would find us again. He would never stop, not until he'd finished what he'd started. And I knew, deep down, that no matter where we ran, no matter how far we tried to escape, he would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. We stumbled down the crowded street, blending into the late-night throngs of people, desperately hoping that the stranger who had haunted us wouldn't dare follow. I felt my friend's grip tighten around my arm as we ducked into a small alleyway, attempting to catch our breath and collect our thoughts. My mind was racing, every instinct screaming that we needed to keep moving, to stay ahead of him. But there was nowhere left to go. We were exhausted, our energy drained by the endless chase, and the city that should have been a sanctuary felt as cold and uncaring as the man pursuing us. The fear lingered, a relentless pulse in the back of my mind, whispering that he was still out there, waiting. "We can't keep running," my friend said, her voice barely a whisper, as though speaking louder might draw him closer. "We need to end this." I looked at her, recognizing the determination in her eyes, but also seeing the same fear that churned in my own gut. She was right. Running had only brought us deeper into his trap, and each time we tried to escape, he was there, anticipating our every move. "But how?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We've tried everything, and he's still out there. Watching. Waiting." She glanced around the alley, her gaze settling on a small diner across the street. Its neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the rain-slick pavement. "Let's go in there. We need a plan, and we can't keep wandering the streets. It's too risky." Reluctantly, I nodded, and together we crossed the street, slipping into the warm, dimly lit diner. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, a strangely comforting reminder of normalcy. We found a booth in the corner, our backs to the wall so we could keep an eye on the door. The few other patrons barely glanced at us, absorbed in their own worlds, oblivious to the horror unfolding just a few feet away. A waitress approached, looking at us with a polite but tired smile. "What can I get you too?" "Just coffee, please," my friend said, her voice steady despite the tension in her posture. The waitress nodded and left us alone, and we sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts, the weight of the situation pressing down on us like a heavy shroud. "We need proof," my friend said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something concrete that we can take to the police, so they can see he's real." I nodded, but doubt not at me. We tried to catch him on camera before, but he always managed to evade us, slipping through our grasp like a shadow. And the police had been skeptical, dismissing our story as paranoia, as some twisted fantasy. But this time, it had to be different. This time, we couldn't let him slip away. Maybe, I hesitated, the thought forming in my mind, terrifying in its boldness. Maybe we need to confront him. If he thinks he's won, if he thinks we're scared and cornered, maybe he'll show himself. My friend's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "You mean, bait him? Let him come to us?" "It's the only way," I said, the words heavy in my mouth. We can't keep hiding. He's been haunting us, cornering us, and if we don't face him, he'll never stop. We'll never be free. The thought filled me with dread, but I knew it was the truth. He was relentless, a predator who thrived on fear, and the only way to break free was to stand our ground, to show him that we weren't afraid, or at least, that we wouldn't let fear control us anymore. We spent the next few hours discussing our plan, going over every detail, every possible outcome. It felt reckless, dangerous, but it was the only choice we had left. We couldn't run anymore, couldn't hide, not if we wanted to reclaim our lives. And as terrifying as the thought of facing him was, there was a strange comfort in having a plan, in knowing that this nightmare was finally coming to an end, one way or another. The diner began to empty as the night wore on, and we lingered, waiting for the right moment to set our plan into motion. My heart pounded in my chest, a steady rhythm of fear and resolve, each beat a reminder of what was at stake. We were stepping into the unknown, into the jaws of the beast, but there was no turning back. At last, we paid our bill and left the diner, stepping back into the cold, silent night. The streets were empty, the world shrouded in darkness, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. We returned to my apartment, moving with quiet determination, every sense alert, every step cautious. The building was eerily silent, the flickering hallway lights casting long shadows that danced across the walls. We made our way up the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the empty corridor, each step bringing us closer to the final confrontation. As we reached the door to my apartment, I paused, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, only silence, only the oppressive weight of our own anticipation. Inside, we set up the room once more, positioning the mirrors, adjusting the lighting, creating a stage for our final showdown. We sat in silence, our nerves taut, our breaths shallow, as we waited for him to come. Minutes passed, stretching into hours, and the tension grew, thickening the air until it felt almost suffocating. My friend's hand rested on my shoulder, a silent reassurance that we were in this together, that whatever happened, we would face it side by side. And then, just as I was beginning to doubt he would come, I heard it, the soft, barely audible sound of footsteps outside the door. My heart skipped a beat, my breath catching in my throat as I glanced at my friend, the fear in her eyes mirroring my own. The footsteps stopped, and a heavy silence settled over the room, thick and oppressive, as though the very walls were holding their breath. I clenched my fists, steeling myself, refusing to let fear take hold. This was the moment we prepared for, the moment we would face the monster who had haunted us for so long. The door creaked open slowly, and a shadow slipped into the room, moving with quiet, predatory grace. I held my breath, watching him through the mirrors, every muscle tensed, every nerve on edge. He was here, he was real, and this time, there would be no escape for either of us. He stepped into the trap, unaware, and for the first time, I felt a surge of confidence, a sense of control. He may have been the predator, but this time, we were ready. This was it. The end was near, one way or another. And I was ready to face it. The tension in the room was almost tangible as we watched him step further into the apartment, each of his movements calculated, almost predatory. My heart thundered in my chest, and I struggled to keep my breathing steady, knowing that the slightest sound might alert him. I could feel my friend beside me, equally tense, yet exuding a sense of determination that steadied me. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never been caught, never been challenged. His gaze swept the room, perhaps searching for signs of our presence, or maybe just savoring the anticipation of his next move. But he didn't know what we had prepared for him, the carefully laid traps, the mirrors angled just so to distort his perception, to make him feel watched, cornered. A flicker of confusion crossed his face as he noticed the setup, and I watched him through the reflection, catching the subtle shift in his expression. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he was not in control here. "Do you feel it?" my friend whispered, so softly that only I could hear. "He's beginning to doubt." It was true. His confident stance wavered, his head tilting as if trying to decipher the purpose of the mirrors. I could sense the unease seeping into his demeanor, a subtle crack in the facade of invulnerability he'd so carefully crafted. He took a few steps closer, and the air grew thicker, the silence almost deafening. My friend and I shared a quick glance. This was our chance, the moment to confront him and bring this nightmare to an end. I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage I had left, and stepped out from behind the makeshift barrier. The man froze, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto mine. For a brief moment, we just stared at each other, two opposing forces caught in a silent standoff. He was expressionless, a mask of calm hiding whatever darkness lurked beneath, but I could see a flicker of surprise, maybe even fear, in his eyes. "You've been following us," I said, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. "Watching, waiting. But it ends here." A slow, unsettling smile crept across his face, and he tilted his head, studying me with a predator's gaze. "You're brave," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Or maybe just foolish." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I refused to let him see my fear. I could feel my friend standing beside me now, her presence grounding me, giving me strength. Together, we faced him, a united front against the monster who had hunted us. "Why?" my friend demanded, her voice laced with defiance. "Why us? What do you want from us?" He chuckled, a low, chilling sound that echoed in the stillness. "It's not about what," he replied, his eyes glinting with something dark and twisted. "It's about control. Fear is a powerful thing, you know. It consumes, it breaks, it transforms." He took a step closer, and I instinctively stepped back, but my friend stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "Not this time," she said, her voice strong and unyielding. "We're not afraid of you anymore." The man's smile faltered, and I saw a flash of anger, quickly concealed. He hadn't expected resistance, hadn't anticipated that his prey might turn and face him. The realization unsettled him, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. "You think you can defy me?" he sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. "I am everywhere. I am everyone's darkest fear, the shadow in the night. You cannot escape me." But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes, the realization that his hold over us was slipping. He had thrived on our fear, on the thrill of the chase, but now, confronted by our defiance, he was losing his power. "We're done running," I said firmly, meeting his gaze. "Whatever hold you had on us, it's over. You don't control us anymore." For a moment, he stood still, his face expressionless, the silence stretching between us. Then, without warning, his mask cracked, and I saw a flicker of something raw and vulnerable, a glimpse of the man behind the monster. He took a step back, his confidence waning, and I realized that he was just a man, after all. Flawed, fragile, and, perhaps, just as haunted by his own fears as we had been by his presence. "We're not afraid," my friend said again, her voice echoing in the small room. "And you have no power here." The finality in her words seemed to strike him like a blow, and he staggered back, the darkness in his eyes fading, replaced by something almost human. He looked at us one last time, his gaze filled with a strange mixture of anger and regret, before turning and disappearing into the shadows, his figure melting into the darkness. And just like that, he was gone. For a moment, we stood in stunned silence, barely daring to breathe, as though he might reappear at any second. But the room remained still, the silence heavy and final. He was gone, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt a sense of peace, a release from the suffocating grip of fear that had held me captive. We stayed there for a long time, letting the reality of what had happened sink in. The nightmare was over, the monster defeated, not by violence or confrontation, but by a refusal to be controlled by fear. As we left the apartment, stepping out into the early dawn, I felt the weight lifting, the shadows receding. The city, once cold and hostile, felt alive and welcoming, a place of possibilities rather than threats. We had faced our darkest fears, and in doing so, we had reclaimed our lives. The memory of that night would linger, the scars of what we endured forever etched into our minds, but we were no longer prisoners of our own terror. We had emerged from the darkness, not unscathed, but stronger, united, and free. We thought it was over. That dawn, stepping out into the fresh air, had felt like freedom, a hard-won victory. For days afterward, I held on to that feeling. I kept telling myself that the nightmare had ended, that he was gone, that I was finally safe. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, a chill would settle over me, and I'd find myself glancing over my shoulder, just to be sure. The relief, however, didn't last. One evening, several weeks later, as I walked home through familiar streets, a strange sense of déjà vu settled over me. Shadows clung to the edges of buildings, stretching toward me as if they had a life of their own. The air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that made my skin prickle. I tried to shake it off, to remind myself that it was just paranoia. But the unease only grew as I approached my apartment. It was a quiet night, no footsteps behind me, no one lurking in the alleyways, and yet, I felt it. A presence. Something dark, watching. Entering my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. The silence pressed in around me, dense and suffocating, a reminder of that night we'd faced him. I walked through each room, checking the windows, peering into closets, telling myself that there was no one there. But as I stood alone in my dimly lit bedroom, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. A small, crumpled piece of paper lay on the floor by my bed. I was certain it hadn't been there when I'd left that morning. With a trembling hand, I picked it up, unrolling it slowly. Scrawled in messy handwriting, barely legible, was a single sentence: "Fear never truly leaves." My breath caught in my throat. How had he been here? When? I looked around, feeling the walls closing in, the shadows pressing closer. Had he returned, just to leave this message? Or had he ever left at all? Panic surged through me, and I fought the urge to scream. I had thought we defeated him, that our defiance had banished the darkness he brought into our lives. But now, standing there with that note in my hand, I realized the truth. He didn't need to be physically present to haunt me. He had embedded himself in my mind, a lingering specter of fear that I could never fully escape. I knew then that this was his final act, his cruelest victory. Even if he never showed his face again, he had already won. Because from that night on, every shadow, every silence, every unfamiliar glance would hold a question, a flicker of doubt, a seed of terror. I would live, but never truly free, haunted by the specter of what he had done. I would never know if he was really gone or if he was watching, waiting, lurking just out of sight. And as the realization settled over me, I knew that his final message was true. Fear never truly leaves. It lingers, hidden, like a shadow in the corner of your mind, waiting for the quiet moments to remind you that some nightmares never end. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.